Why did it get so quiet? I just think that's really amazing. Most of the time, the audience is engaged with each other and telling stories, and it's kind of like, what did you do this summer? But all of you realized it was 9:30. I better get to work. Anyway, welcome, everyone, and good morning. My name is Pedro Nava. I'm the chair of the Little Hoover Commission. Before we begin, I want to introduce the other commissioners who are here. To my right is a newly appointed Commissioner Schwamberger and the vice chair, Sean Varner. I want to welcome Commissioner Schwamberger to the commission. This is her first hearing. She was appointed to the commission by the Senate Rules Committee in April of 2018. In her day job, she's an associate general counsel for State Farm Mutual Automobile Insurance Company. And thank you very much. And express our gratitude to the appointing authority for selecting you to be a part of our team.
Thank you.
I want to take a moment also to welcome Jeannie Wolf on my left. She's our new acting executive director. She's been with the state of California for over 25 years, and she brings a wealth of knowledge to the commission, and I think all of us, commissioners and staff, agree that we're very, very fortunate to have you. Thank you and welcome. Now, we also have our Little Hoover team who has been working diligently on this study, led by our project manager, Crystal Beckham. Crystal, raise your hand. You're not anonymous anymore. With assistance from research analyst Julissa Delgado. Raise your hand, please, Julissa. Thank you. Administrative analyst Sherry McAllister. That's you. And our graduate student assistant, Mark Johnson. Welcome, Mark. He's a relatively new addition to our team. Today is our first hearing on the security of California's voting equipment. This study was initially suggested during the Commission's voter participation study, which is currently ongoing as well. I know many of you in the audience have been involved in the voter participation study, and I want to thank you for your interest in that work as well. There are many serious concerns about the integrity of elections in the United States, particularly in the wake of revelations from our federal intelligence agencies that Russia attempted to interfere in the 2016 United States general election. And I think I can say that without equivocation. Recently, the United States Justice Department announced indictments against 12 Russian nationals as part of Special Counsel Robert Mueller's investigation of Russian interference in the 2016 election. This study is thus both timely and relevant. The study focuses on a crucial part of elections here in our state, the security of California's voting equipment. The purpose of this hearing is to learn what security threats face California, how is California addressing those threats, and are there better ways to secure voting equipment? In thinking about this yesterday, it occurred to me that we take so much for granted with respect to our elections. We assume that when we mark the bubble or hit the touch screen or whatever else it is that we do to mark our vote, our expression of our confidence and faith and trust in this government and who it is we want to speak for us in those representative capacities, we assume that that vote is counted, that it goes where it's supposed to go, and that it has and carries with it the significance of all of the sacrifices that so many have made to democracy and to what this country stands for. I'm not entirely convinced that that is the case in each and every ballot. And so I'm very, very pleased that all of you share our interest in the sanctity and the integrity of how our votes are collected and counted. The Commission will first hear from Pamela Smith. She's a senior advisor from Verified Voting, and Noel Runyan, owner of Personal Data Systems. They will provide their expert opinions on the current state of voting equipment security in California and the security threats we face. They will also share their recommendations on how the state can best address these threats. Next, the Commission will hear from a panel of leaders in math, science, and technology. This includes Philip Stark, Associate Dean of the Department of Mathematical and Physical Sciences, and also a professor at the Department of Statistics at the University of California, Berkeley, and John Sebes, the Chief Technology Officer of the Open Source Technology Institute. These panelists will discuss new models for increasing security. We'll then hear from two people who have boots-on-the-ground perspective of voting equipment security. Kammi Foote is the Clerk-Recorder for Inyo County. Kenneth Bennett is the program manager for the Voting Solutions for All People project in the Los Angeles Clerk-Recorder's office. These panelists will discuss the security threats they encounter and protect against, and provide a practical perspective on the implementation of best practices to improve security. Finally, Susan Lapsley, Deputy Secretary and Counsel for the Secretary of State's office, will discuss how her office is protecting voting equipment in California and implementing best practices. She will also share their vision for voting equipment security going forward. I want to express my gratitude to all of you who are participating. You do so without a stipend, without pay, and no reimbursement of travel expenses. Thank you again very much. There will be an opportunity for public comment following the testimony of the scheduled witnesses. Public comment will be limited to 3 minutes per person. Please notify the commission staff who raised their hand before if you'd like to provide public comment. Today's hearing will be recorded by Assembly TV and streamed live over the internet by the California channel. If you want to offer public comment, there's a speaker slip that you can fill out so that we have a record of who you are, who you represent, and then we'll be sure to call you. Following the hearing, the Commission will convene its business meeting across the street in Conference Room 175 of 925 L Street. I want to thank the witnesses who submitted written testimony. I ask that you briefly summarize the major points of your testimony so we can focus on the discussion. If the Executive Director will please be good enough to call our first witnesses.
Right. Thank you, Chairman. Our first panel is an introduction to voting equipment security. How do voters know their vote counts? Pamela Smith is a senior advisor for verified voting, and Noel Runyan is the owner of Personal Data Systems. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. I will go first. I applaud the Little Hoover Commission for taking up this crucial topic for investigation, and I'm really pleased to participate in and contribute to that effort, and I hope you'll have many questions. At Verified Voting, I've worked with advocates and election officials and lawmakers across the country. In my experience, the states that do the best on voting system security are the ones that keep looking for and embracing opportunities to improve. Security threats don't stand still, so neither can those whose work it is to safeguard our elections and democracy. And I would start by saying election security is not an on-off switch, where a thing is either secure or it's not. Rather, it involves incrementing layers of effort, of analysis, of systems and procedures, all created or conducted by people, all while balancing costs and priorities. These incremental measures can harden a system, making it more secure than before, and can solve for problems when they occur. Now, I'm not saying it'll make it totally secure. As hard as we try, there will always be another vulnerability discovered. Perfect security is not attainable, but that should not discourage our effort. Diligence in the pursuit of secure elections is attainable. We should take what steps we can so as to not make it easy for tampering to occur, even while recognizing there's no such thing as a completely tamper-proof system. And if we focus on reducing and mitigating for vulnerabilities and on recoverability, no matter what happens, we can say to the public, we take these steps to ensure that all will be able to have confidence in the accuracy of the outcome and that everyone who wanted to participate was able to do so. If voters know that elections are working the way that they should, that we're taking all possible steps to secure the vote, they can have the confidence to participate. We gain this added benefit of removing the obstacle to participation of lack of confidence. And this work isn't the responsibility of election officials alone. Lawmakers also must support this effort by finding ways to ensure that those hardworking officials have the resources they need to meet both the demands of running elections generally and the special requirements of addressing today's intense security threat environment and meeting the issues that arise with resilience. Good elections require technology to be available, to be functioning correctly and reliably. Secure elections require us to be able to prove that this was the case. It's useful to look at security issues in voting technology through the filter of how they will affect the ability of a voter to cast an effective ballot. In this context, effective means the voter is not derailed in their quest to vote by a failed electronic poll book or a tampered registration list. It means the ballot is available to the voter, and any system to be used for marking the ballot is available to the voter. The voter receives the correct ballot. It's presented to them complete, no contests missing. It's feasible for the voter to mark and check and verify on a physical ballot and cast the ballot safely and privately. The ballot is counted correctly along with all the other ballots, and most importantly, we can demonstrate that fact to the satisfaction of the public, including to those on the side of the losing candidate. Cybersecurity experts agree that security breaches are not a matter of if but when. Assuming such problems will occur, fail-safes have to be in place. For election system security, you need to be able to prevent and detect tampering. That's obviously important, but for secure election outcomes and ensuring that all voters who show up can cast an effective ballot, even more critical is the ability to recover real time and after the fact. That means even if there's a voter registration breach that we couldn't prevent, or undetected tampering in your voting system software, or some machines broke down or failed on election day, people can still vote and votes are still counted correctly. And technology touches elections not just through the system we use to mark the ballot and or to tally the votes, but also the systems for registering to vote, update a registration, store a registration, electronic poll books, systems called ballot on demand, which together must be able to find the right information for each voter, produce the right ballot out of many styles, and even the networks election officials use to give information to voters and to do election night reporting. Some of these are more mission critical than others, but it all matters in terms of cyber threats as disruption, not just tampering. So election system security requires not only working to prevent these breaches, but create the fail-safes. With voting systems, voters need to be able to confirm firsthand that their ballots were indeed marked as they intended. And election officials must be able to use those ballots to demonstrate that all votes were included and counted as cast. What connects the voter to correctly reported outcomes is a physical artifact that serves as legitimate evidence of the voter's intent. A physical ballot and a process for checking a robust audit. The physical ballot, not just a screen version, has to have been available to the voter for his or her review before they cast it. Not all voters will do that review and check carefully, but the ballot they had the chance to review is the only record that can be construed to represent their intent. So voting systems can produce an after-the-fact printout. They may be called ballot images or printed cast vote records, but if the voter didn't see that thing, then there's no confirmation that it's actually a record of their intent. That's because when the voter sees the screen and then later there's a printout they don't see, faulty software could have rendered that printout inaccurately or incorrectly. And the voter isn't there to say, yes, that's how I voted, or hey, wait a minute. Then you have no way to confirm. Checking the software's functioning requires a post-election audit. I won't go into detail because you'll hear from Dr. Stark, except to say that California gets this partially right. We have paper, we do audits of a sort, not robustly enough yet. Another thing we get partially right is we do prohibit any part of the voting system from being connected to the internet, which is an obvious avenue for hacking intrusion or transmittal of malware. It's not the only avenue for transmitting malware, but it's an obvious one. This reduces the attack surface available to those who would tamper and mitigates for remote attacks on live voting and other purposes. I would say California is more prepared in its front line against nation-state adversaries than some states. We required papers long back in 2004. We've had a requirement in place for a basic manual tally audit conducted by every county for decades. We tested more robust audits in a pilot program passed by the legislature in 2010. We've had reviews of voting systems that have been stringent and looked at software. We initiated a regular practice of volume testing of voting systems submitted for certification and passed more stringent requirements for testing and certification in 2013 under SB 360. And we also certify peripheral things like ballot-on-demand printers and remote accessible vote-by-mail systems. There's more work to be done, however. Audits must be robust enough to strictly limit the risk of confirming an incorrect outcome. And I think it's important to note that some counties have substantially greater resources than others, but all counties need security resources. The Secretary of State has called for funding for more up-to-date equipment and for cybersecurity efforts. That was supported in recent appropriations. And the new Office of Election Cybersecurity should help. We recommend California commit to the development of risk-limiting audits beyond a pending bill, which is time-delimited and opt-in only, and fund that development so that we can conduct true statewide confirmation of election outcomes. We further recommend that California continue to strengthen its requirements for testing, including electronic poll book testing. We recommend the state continue to engage with technology experts. There is a wealth of scientists in this state that has already done substantial work relating to voting system security. We recommend California continue to support the development of non-proprietary systems that meet or exceed current security guidelines, and that the state fulfills its funding commitments to the county elections offices. And given the current threat environment, we recommend that California ensure this prohibition on internet connections remains in place for the foreseeable future, and that the state reduce or eliminate the electronic transmission of voted ballots while working to ensure that military and overseas voters are indeed able to vote securely. And with that, I'll close, and thank you, and look forward to questions.
Before the next witness, does anybody have any questions or comments at this juncture? Let me I do. You've probably seen more and more a movement towards the vote by mail. Mm-hmm. Now, is the vote by mail process any more secure than the traditional polling stations where you would show up and ask your name and look at a list? And I see. I guess it's Mr. Runyan is shaking his head no, but for you, Ms. Smith, any distinction there?
Well, there are some advantages and disadvantages. If we were living in the state of Georgia where they're using paperless touchscreen voting machines exclusively in the state, then I would say maybe they should consider vote by mail. The voter has a physical record of their intent. If there is a good, secure chain of custody through the postal mail or through delivery direct to the officials, then that's a good thing. You've got an auditable system, unlike what they have now. Mm-hmm. The concerns that relate to vote by mail are several. A major concern is coercion. But in a model like the Voter Choice Act, where you have vote centers, you can both receive a vote by mail ballot and then bring it in and vote in person in a location where it is more secure. Nobody is allowed to look over your shoulder while you're voting or tell you to vote a certain way. So there are some advantages to having a hybrid system. I think the coercion is the biggest piece, but vote by mail is something we've done for many, many years here in California. And in fact, no excuse vote by mail is something that many other states don't do. So I would consider it an advantage in many ways.
The verified voting is based where? California?
California.
And I see that you've testified before the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on House Administration. Mm-hmm. And have you also done this sort of consulting work or advocacy in other states?
Oh, yes.
Okay, like where?
All over the country.
Okay.
We've testified in Maryland on post-election audits and on paper ballots. We've have people who have worked on this issue in Florida. We worked with the Secretary of State's office in Colorado on their risk-limiting audits. There's just been a wide variety. I've been doing this since 2004, and as president of Verified Voting for a decade until 2017. So, pretty much all over the country.
And based on your experience and what you've seen, and it's kind of a broad question, and I'm sure I know how to frame it, but where would you place California with respect to integrity of the voting equipment and the integrity of the vote?
Well, I think because we get it right on paper, and because we do work to have better testing and certification, and because we do at least a minimum level of auditing every election of every contest, I think we're well ahead of many states.
Okay.
There are it's important to understand the majority of the country votes on paper or with a paper record. There are 5 states that are exclusively paperless. There's another 9 or so that have some paperless equipment in some jurisdictions. So the rest of the country is using paper like California, but that's been a more recent development. The movement towards everyone papering up has been more recent. Not all states have any kind of audit. Probably only half or just over half of the states have some kind of audit. And in many cases, it's more rudimentary than what we have. In Florida, it's as rudimentary as it gets. It's a contest selected at random and pretty minimal. So we do better on that metric than many other states.
And then I just have one other, and it looks like you have a question, but the issue of proprietary versus non-proprietary in the software, what is the significance of that?
When your voting system essentially doesn't let you look under the hood, when the software is proprietary, and in fact, in many instances, you don't own it, you only lease it, you're at the mercy of the quality of those who developed it and who market it. You'll hear from Los Angeles County where they felt that that wasn't a good enough solution and have worked to design their own with much greater transparency built in. One of the benefits of transparency of non-proprietary software is that it gives the public a better sense of, you're not trying to hide something here. You're more interested in having a system that's open and transparent. And I would add, a lot of people think that, security through obscurity is the way to go, but that doesn't work.
Right.
Someone will always figure out a way in. So it's better to have the transparency than to not have it.
Thank you. Commissioner?
Yeah, based on your experience, what would be 2 or 3 things that California could do to incrementally improve the system?
First of all, a shout out to the election officials who are part of a statewide association of election officials, and they get together and address these points and look at how they can make improvements. But they do all that with limited resources. I think making sure that election officials are funded to do the kind of work they need to do is important. For me, one of the most important things is having risk-limiting audits so that we can provide strong confirmation of the correctness of the outcome. And I think you'll hear from Dr. Stark, but the pieces that go into making an audit a good audit, the sort of chain of custody of voting materials and ballots and that sort of thing, that's something that can be further developed. That's an incremental improvement. I think that those are kind of the key pieces right now.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Runyan, welcome.
Thank you. I first got involved in this voting system issue back in the early 2000s, as many of us got very interested after the hanging chad issues in Florida and the Help America Vote Act, which was designed to bring in this new generation of voting access. And I was very excited because, having worked in the field of making accessible computers for so many years, I knew that we could make systems that would do large print on screens and have speech output. All that was easy to do with computers. But what we ended up getting was systems that were very poorly designed, and I would even use the word shoddily designed, that did not give good access. The accessibility and security both were tacked on like tourniquets or Band-Aids. And we ended up with a situation where people that were advocating for accessibility and people that were advocating for security on these systems were at odds because it was seen to be or assumed to be incompatible. At least that's what we were getting from the vendors at the time. So I got very involved in testing these systems and documenting it. I have submitted my experiences after 18 different, each time I voted on the voting systems in Santa Clara County, I would write them up, and I've submitted that to you as part of my testimony. But I've also worked with California State on testing the voting system's accessibility here, and in that also discovered an access-related security threat because the machines were actually transmitting the audio signal of the ballot on the radio so you could pick it up out in the parking lot. So there are we found some of these machines actually were so poorly done that they had some access-related security issues. I can go into those more later for you if you want, and it's also in my main testimony, some of it. But the folks from the disabilities community weren't saying, we don't care about security, we just want access. They were saying, we want access and we don't know anything really about security, so we don't know that that's important. Over the years, we have gotten the community to realize that both accessibility and security are very important principles that have to be built in from the very beginning. And this is one of the essential things that's missing in most of the voting systems that California is using today, is well-integrated accessibility and security. And that includes accessibility to one important part of the voting system, which the process, which is verification. In most of our systems in California, I can't verify my ballot, however it's been generated, and in a meaningful way. And so that can be done, though. And what I think the Los Angeles County's VSAP system that they've designed, I've been, as Pam and others here, involved in that some. We were very glad to see that from the very get-go in their voting principles they developed, it included accessibility and security as part of the design considerations from the beginning. And that allowed us to synthesize those things together in a compatible way. That's a very important thing about all of our future systems going forward, is that we demand systems that have the kinds of capability that the Los Angeles system has for assuring accessibility with verification, as well as the rest of the process.
Mr. Runyan, let me ask, that insistence on those principles, is that going to be done at the state level or by county?
I think it has to be done certainly at the county levels. I think the state can guide by helping to make sure that all counties have, through their the associations Pam has mentioned, has those guidelines. I think Los Angeles County is a very good model of how things can be done differently that way. We also, though, have the issues of how best we can improve the systems that we have today, that are legacy systems without substantial funding we aren't going to replace in the next couple of years. And we also have some other systems such as remote accessible voting, which I'd like to talk about too, that have some real security issues and privacy issues.
But isn't part of the dilemma, and I'm assuming my arithmetic is still good, 58 counties, right? California? Mm-hmm. So what you're saying is that there have to be 58 efforts to implement the principles that you are articulating need to be done.
Not quite. Those are principles that are very involved in the ground-up design and development of the system. I think you can take the open system that Los Angeles has designed and use that as a model, even if you're going to have somebody manufacture a new system with some new additions to it. But people also could just take the current system Los Angeles County is going to share with the rest of the world and pat any other vendors on the back if they copy it.
Yeah, you see, and I guess that's the point that I'm trying to get to. One of it's like, how do you make people do stuff that maybe they don't want to do? Mm-hmm. And how do you make them do things that they say it's going to cost us money? And how do you make them do things that they're saying, like, we've never had to do it before, so why do we have to do it now? Mm-hmm. That, so it really does seem to me that it puts a burden on people of good intentions mm-hmm. and advocacy groups to pressure counties to basically do the right thing. Mm-hmm. So what if the Little Hoover Commission had a way, right, to compel the counties to do it, what would you want us to do?
Well, I think there's several things that the Little Hoover Commission can do from the state side down, which also includes things to improve security of the current systems that we have. And I could discuss those more later and somewhere in my written testimony.
Okay.
But as far as new systems, I think that needs to come from state leadership that really helps to make sure the funding is available to help the counties, and but provides the leadership in pointing to models like Los Angeles County.
All right, good. Thank you. Please continue.
There are systems currently in place that have varying degrees of security, and some of which were misdone. We have things like a requirement that if one person votes on a voting machine, that you have to have at least 4 more people. That was well-intentioned to try to improve privacy, but it's actually backfired and is actually disenfranchising people. So I think we should look at those things that we're doing with the current systems to try to improve them. There's a lot can be done, like not allowing, and this can come from the state level down, not allowing overnighting of voting systems, not allowing the use of flexible zipper bags in the security and stuff. Those are general things that could be used to improve it from the top down. There are some things, like we have something called Remote Accessible Vote by Mail, RAVBM. That's where I could use a computer at home with whatever access system I have, if I'm lucky enough to have one, and not too elderly to be able to use it. Or I could use that system to download a ballot from my county, that's the correct ballot, and vote on it, print it on my computer, and then either mail it or take it to a vote center. That's a system that can be very flexible, but there's a real danger in it, and I'm nervous about it because it doesn't define who uses it. Presumably, it's people with disabilities. It might be GI serving overseas. But those kinds of systems have real dangers, as Pam had mentioned some, is in the coercion things and vote selling, those kinds of things that can't be monitored. Also, that you can extend accessibility too far by allowing people already in the grave to vote. So those are things that I have some concerns about, and in particular, as we found in Toronto, Canada, when they were discussing a remote access by vote by mail, that people are not comfortable defining publicly what their disabilities might be. They might have an embarrassing reading disability, but are passing as not being disabled. And so it is very difficult to get people to really define or accept a system that requires that they define themselves as having certain disabilities. So I don't think you can really limit that kind of system. And what I'd like to underline is although people with disabilities really want to demand and see meaningful, accessible voting, which they have a right to do legally, we aren't willing to say, no matter what it does to make the rest of the system insecure. We want to see the system be secure. We don't want to be used as an excuse for accepting a very poor system that exposes and makes the whole system vulnerable. So we want to see that. In this case, allowing remote accessible voting becomes a very dangerous slippery slope that could start to be used by a lot of people, and the next thing we know, people are demanding to be able to vote by their phone from the comfort of their pajamas. So we'd like to see that carefully controlled. Another thing that has to go along with that is good public outreach that can be encouraged from the state level and down with the Secretary of State's office and others making good models for publicly informing people. The vote by mail is already disenfranchising a lot of people, and especially people with disabilities who go to a polling place and haven't brought along the envelope that showed up in the mail. That was just more junk mail to some people with disabilities, and they don't know that they get to the polling place and they won't be allowed to vote privately. They can't use the machines to do a provisional vote in the polling place.
Yeah, can you explain that a little bit more? I mean, because that is an interesting consequence of vote by mail.
Okay, so all voters that get a vote by mail ballot are supposed to, if they want to vote at the polling place, they have to take it with them to render before being allowed to cast a ballot at the polling place. If I show up at the polling place without my vote by mail ballot, and I've actually gone along to monitor voting experiences in Alameda County, as I've done for the last couple of years, and seen people show up without their vote by mail ballots. And when they get there, they try to vote. They're told, well, you're listed as having a vote by mail ballot. Where is it? We can only let you vote provisionally. However, the voting machines, if a person with disability wants to vote on the voting machine, Those machines can't do it provisionally because the machines are not allowed to track your identity through the electronic ballots on those voting machines. So with those voting machines we have today, that can't be done. So we just would be, I would end up at the polling place not able to vote provisionally.
Do we have, and I want to welcome Commissioner Parada, thank you. Do we have statistics or data on the frequency that occurs to folks with disabilities who have not been able to vote because of that scenario that you just described?
I don't think we have it statewide. We have in Alameda County on this program I've been helping to monitor. Yes, we have data about how many people showed up and voted on the machines. And an interesting point there is with maybe 800 different precincts in Alameda County, the Oakland area and such, we ended up with about 80 people voting on the machines. That's a little bit shocking by itself that the outreach is so poor that nobody is going to vote on those machines. Well, but we had at least half a dozen that people we knew weren't able to vote when they tried to vote on those machines.
Well, you know, that's disturbing because you can't manage what you can't measure. And if we don't have data, and if counties are not required to obtain and maintain and report instances as you've described, then you never really have a sense of how large the problem
That's right.
is.
And you need to do that for a couple of reasons. As we saw in Alameda County, their reporting system that they had was not adequate to detect a lot of the problems. Unless it actually resulted in a trouble ticket, where they called it in, got a trouble ticket number and all, it wasn't reported. So an example of a problem where the keypads weren't plugged into the right plug on the back of the machine, that they may never discover that. The county has told us, well, this problem's never happened. We've never had to report it. I said, yes, but your reporting system wouldn't have covered it.
Right.
So I would like to see some models where presented to counties that these are the kind of things you should collect at the polling place. Not that we want to make polling workers' job any bigger, but these are individual incidents that need to be reported. Those have the advantage of helping to build that statistical database that you're talking about, so you can monitor the level of problem. But it also has the advantage that it gives you feedback for where maybe you need more poll worker education or voter outreach education to solve those problems.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we've got about 6 minutes left in this segment, and we have a Commissioner Varner.
Mr. Runyan, thank you for your testimony. You'd indicated that one of the important aspects is to integrate accessibility with security, and that verification's an issue. Through the testimony that we've received written, everyone refers back to this pilot program in LA County's doing, and we actually had the opportunity to test that when we were down there in LA a few months ago. Just so that we have an understanding, what exactly, from your perspective, did that system? How was that system an improvement on where we're at today? I just kind of want to get a sense of what your experience is with that hardware and software, so that if it's something that we want to look at implementing statewide, how that could be integrated on a statewide basis and maybe help with the problems we're discussing.
Okay, for one, it took all of the obvious accessibility design things that should have been in the machines that the legacy machines we have in this state, that it made possible for people in wheelchairs to actually get up near the machine and reach the touchscreen, for example, which we can't in some of our machines today. But it made sure that you had real magnified large print text, which our current machines don't do, most of them. And it also, though, handled the 10 to 12 different languages possibilities that Los Angeles County has to deal with. So somebody that can only operate a manual switch, yes, no, or sip and puff, can use the system to vote. So we developed a in precinct polling place terminal called a ballot marking device that anyone can use. Significantly, the ballot doesn't have to be taken from the machine and manually handled by someone who can't handle it with a motor impairment. It doesn't have to be taken across the polling place and stuffed into a ballot box. There are ballot boxes on the back of each machine so everybody can can avoid handling the ballot if they want. And very significantly for verification, it will give us access to our printed ballot so we can actually pull it out of the machine and walk away with it to verify it with our own little portable OCR system, or hold it up close to the face of someone who has low vision to read it. So all these factors went into the design, and they've come up with a very good design where people are standing can see it, or people in a wheelchair, the display can tilt down so they can use it. So in those ways, it was designed to be very flexible just in the polling place. But it has some other factors that are very important. One is it allows you to, at home, at your own convenience, with your own access capability, any of the voters can make up what I call a vote carrier, or they call a poll pass, which is either printed or on your smartphone, barcoded list of your selections. So you walk into the polling place, you're in a hurry, you've got kids in the car, you can't take a lot of time. You walk up the polling place machine, scan your poll pass or vote carrier in front of the machine, and it automatically enters everything you had on that. So you can just check it, review it on the screen real quick, and print your ballot, have it automatically cast in the ballot box, and you're done. So we think that will actually improve voting times and in both times in polling places. It also allows people that need to be able to do their ballot at home to be able to take their time to mark up their ballot at home without pressures of people in line behind them and stuff. But the system also includes, a very big element of it is the centralized counting system that can accept vote-by-mail ballots or the ballots from the ballot marking devices in the precinct. And that's a very flexible system as well. So one of the things that Dean Logan insisted on in that whole design was that it be flexible, because he didn't want to be just one legislative action away from being obsolete. He wanted the system to be able to adapt, and so it has been designed as a very adaptable system that can adapt to other counties' needs as well as changing needs for Los Angeles County.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Do you have any other questions or comments from commissioners? Seeing none. I want to express our gratitude to you for the work that you do and for taking the time to share your experiences and your knowledge with us. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
If we could have the next panel, please.
Our next panel concerns new models to improve voting equipment security. Philip Stark is the Associate Dean of the Department of Mathematical and Physical Sciences and is a professor at the Department of Statistics at the University of California, Berkeley. John Sebes is co-founder and the Chief Technology Officer at the Open Source Technology Institute. Please join us at the witness table. Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you.
I'm assuming you sort of figured out who's going to go first.
Your choice.
Okay. Well, I'll do the simple thing and follow the agenda. Mr. Stark?
Okay. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much for having me here. I understand that my written testimony is part of the record, and so I'll try to keep things brief and just hit highlights, essentially from the executive summary. We all know there's no such thing as an unhackable computer system any more than there's an unpickable lock. There might be systems that haven't been hacked yet, but that doesn't mean that they can't be hacked, and given sufficient motivation and resources, they will be. There's no way that we can harden the electronic side of voting sufficiently to be sure that our election outcomes correctly reflect voter intent without doing something else. The easiest thing we can do to provide a backstop and ensure that the electronic tabulation gives the right result is to rely on paper. Paper is obviously also vulnerable. There are serious issues around ensuring that, first of all, the paper correctly reflects voter intent, and secondly, that the correct ballots are included in the tallies, that the determination of voter eligibility and giving people the right ballot, so forth and so on, happens correctly, and then maintaining secure physical custody of those ballots up through the time that an audit has taken place. And that's a non-trivial problem, and it's one place that California, I think, can greatly improve its regulations around just the paper handling and improve security. The advantages that paper have over electronic, first of all, electronic records can be altered in a way that is undetectable. It's much more difficult to alter paper in a way that is undetectable and undetected, especially if you have good ballot accounting on top of your voting system. It's also possible to alter electronic records wholesale. If you compromise a system, you can compromise everything in it. Paper is more difficult to compromise wholesale. Because of this, and because physical security is something that is relatively well understood in the world, I think that the appropriate way for us to secure our voting systems is to do what we can to harden the electronic side, but really rely on the paper record as a backup. It is the way that we can provide an independent check of whether the electronic systems function correctly. Currently, the way that we run elections in the United States is largely procedure-based, that we rely on equipment having been certified by the federal government or by the state, depending on where we live. We rely on election officials following various procedures around voter registration, around issuing ballots, so forth and so on. And we sort of then rely on the procedures having produced the right result for that reason. And what I've been advocating for some years is moving from that system to an evidence-based system, where it's not enough to follow a procedure. You actually have to provide evidence that you got the right answer. It isn't enough for the local election official to actually find out who really won. They have to provide evidence that will convince a reasonable person that they'd found out who really won. And that's where auditing of various kinds really comes in and can not only demonstrate to elections officials themselves that they got the right answer, but also demonstrate to the public and convince the electorate that the votes were tallied correctly. So this idea that evidence-based elections, that elections should be conducted in a way that gives the public convincing evidence that the reported election outcomes are correct.
But, I mean, it seems particularly important given what we've heard recently, where you've got the President of the United States, don't believe what you see or read. Stick with us. Calling into, you see, this is why I think this whole topic is so critically important, is because I'm 70 years old, and for the first time that I can recall, we really are confronted with two separate and distinct theories and philosophies of reality. One is based on a chief executive who is telling us, I have the truth, believe no one but me, and then the rest of the world. And your notion, which is procedure versus evidence, and as lawyers, those of us that are lawyers, the evidence part is pretty near and dear to us. So I really am interested, and I think it's justifiable that the issue of evidence be one that be elevated.
A metaphor, an analogy I use is that relying on procedures and relying on certified equipment is like a brain surgeon saying, I used a sterile scalpel and therefore the operation went well. There's no need to look at the patient. And auditing is about looking at the patient to make sure that the operation went well. So how do we get this evidence? So first of all, we need paper. The paper needs to be voter verifiable, and this is a place where I actually have some nagging concerns about what is going on in Los Angeles, and I'm hoping that more evidence will be presented with regard to that. No particular intent to keep emphasizing evidence. My concern there is for voters who have the dexterity to handle paper and have the visual acuity to be able to read the paper and mark it, introducing technology between trying to signal your intent and that intent showing up on the paper introduces an extra step that needs to be verified. If you're marking the ballot directly yourself, you don't need to check whether the paper shows what. I mean, you might make a mistake, but it's different from having a layer of technology in between that might not record your intent accurately. If the equipment is functioning correctly, I understand that there is evidence that people have an easier time correctly signaling their voter intent through some of the interfaces like the VSAP is using. That said, actually verifying that the paper shows what you intend is not trivial. And I've gone through the exercise myself, and especially for a California-style ballot where we vote on dozens and dozens of things, including similarly named measures that have the opposite implications, it's very difficult to tell from an abbreviated description of the contest whether it really is what you intended to vote in this thing, or even to tell if a contest is missing. So for me to use a system like that to verify my ballot, I also have to make notes on the side so I can compare the printed thing with my notes. I can't just compare it with my memory. That said, it does produce something that in principle is voter verifiable, and that's absolutely huge. Okay, sorry, my machine is going to sleep. Give me a second.
That's why paper's better.
Paper's better. It doesn't log out on you. Nor does it panic when it can't when you can't type the password. Okay, so how do we provide this evidence? We need the voter verified paper. We need to keep track of the paper. We need to verify that we have kept track of the paper well with what's called a compliance audit. You need to be able to check that you can account for all the paper you've got, that you can account for the custody of that paper. You need to use appropriate physical seals on the bundles of paper that are getting transported from place to place. You need to make sure that they're kept under surveillance. There's an example that Roger Johnson, who did physical security for Argonne National Labs, from nuclear materials, uses, where he was doing sort of a security inspection of a local election official's process, and found a box of ballots that had tape, security tape all over it, clearly very, very secure. Flip the box open, and you can open it from the bottom with no seals on the bottom. So the way that you do this really does matter. You need numbered seals. You need to make sure they're not easy to bypass or remove or forge or so forth and that. And that's a place where California and every other jurisdiction where I've looked has room for a lot of improvement. So assuming that we've kept track of the paper well and can verify that we've got that we have the paper unadulterated, unsubstituted, no ballots added or lost, then we can do a risk limiting audit. And that's the piece of the puzzle that I've focused on most. What is a risk limiting audit? A risk limiting audit is any procedure that has the property that if a full hand count of the ballots would show a different outcome, you have a big chance of performing that full hand count. The full hand count sets the record straight. We would never overturn an election outcome on the basis of statistical evidence alone, only on the basis of 100% hand count. So what is the outcome? Well, I'm using outcome as a term of art. I don't mean the exact vote count. You're not going to get the same exact vote count. The outcome is the political consequences. So who won? Does there need to be a runoff election? Did the measure pass or not pass? Things like that. That's what I mean. You can't get perfect precision, but you can get that. So that full hand count gives what is sort of legally the correct outcome almost by definition, because a full hand count of the ballots is sort of the legal correct outcome. It gives the will of the people if the ballots are trustworthy themselves, if you've actually kept track of the paper well enough. The art in risk limiting audits is not in ensuring that there's a big chance of a full hand count if the outcome is wrong. You can do that by just doing a full hand count every time. The art is in reducing the workload when the outcome is right. So how do you do something that's extremely efficient if you're just be wasting your time by doing a full hand count and yet have a big chance of doing a full hand count if that's going to matter? And there, the efficiency of the process really depends deeply on the equipment that the local election official is using, how the local election official organizes its paper, and various other things. There's a lowest common denominator method called ballot polling that any jurisdiction that has paper and keeps track of the paper can use. It doesn't require the voting system to do anything special, although we do have now on the books in California, I believe SB 360 requires any new systems to be amenable to a more efficient form of auditing called ballot level comparison auditing. But as long as you've got paper and you can pull paper ballots at random, you can do a ballot polling risk limiting audit. And just to give you a calibration point, for the gubernatorial primary this year in California, to confirm the two finalists who are going on to the general election, would have required looking at approximately 450 ballots statewide to confirm that they were the two proper winners using a ballot polling audit. So that's something we could have done with the equipment we have today. It is not expensive in the grand scheme of things. So I recognize that mandating auditing is an unfunded mandate unless some money comes for it. That would not take a lot of money. So I think that kind of our ramp up that I would like to see us do is start ballot polling audits of statewide contests immediately. That will help in conjunction with that to promulgate regulations that ensure that the paper trail really is adequately preserved, to make sure that we really can trust the paper trail and demonstrate that it's trustworthy. And then as jurisdictions replace their equipment, SB 360 will ensure that they replace it with equipment that is amenable to more efficient forms of auditing that will make it economical to audit smaller contests. And so I think that doing statewide contests, federal contests, and then countywide contests are all kind of in scope right now. And as equipment gets replaced, we can start thinking about doing smaller contests than contests that are on every ballot in a particular county. You raised the issue earlier of open source and what the role of open source is. I think open source is a really good idea, but not necessarily from the security side. I think that it really is because of the economic ecosystem that surrounds voting right now, and that having an open source system would accomplish a number of things. One, I think that it could completely change the economics of voting. Jurisdictions could start saving an enormous amount of taxpayer money immediately and have more auditable systems and have a competitive market for maintenance and support of those systems. And one of the consequences right now of the proprietary vendor systems is that jurisdictions are paying what I consider to be inflated prices for the hardware and greatly inflated prices for the support and maintenance.
You see, this is, again, as I was talking with staff about some of the aspects of this particular topic, the challenge, it seems to me, is how do we integrate what we want to get done from the state's perspective with the level of authority that the counties have. And so when your SB 360 might be a vehicle to do some of those things, I'm not, because like, for example, if we're talking about open source, and let's assume that what you say is accurate, that the proprietary, go ahead, stop me.
Forgive me,
Stop
I
me.
might have, now I'm having a moment of confusion whether it was SB 360 or AB 44, but one of
Okay.
those. Yeah, apologize. Yeah.
All right, I mean, there are some legislative avenues that are available. And if, I don't know, and I suppose this is something that we'd have to take a look at, is could the state, it's not likely that the state would be able to mandate open source, because clearly there's proprietary systems that counties have gone out and purchased. But maybe the state could offer incentives to get more open source being used at the county level.
So I don't think the state needs to mandate open source.
Okay.
I think that it will sell itself if there is an open source system available. And the cost of developing that system, part of which has already been undertaken by Los Angeles. San Francisco has something in process. There's work that's been done in Travis County, Texas, around StarVote. There's a lot of pieces that can start to form the basis of a system like this. That the economics of it will drive local jurisdictions to do it.
So I think that maybe as we move forward with this, and one of the things for staff to look at is this question. I think you set up a table, perhaps, because I'm a simple guy and I like to see stuff side by side, so that if I see that if we do open source, it costs me $10, but if I do proprietary, it's $10,000. That might persuade me that I really want to go to the $10. Yeah.
So there's one other piece of it, though, which right now I think many vendors and many local elections officials, and I shouldn't speak for all of them, but one might speak for herself later. What they get from the voting system vendor is not just the equipment; they get support.
Right.
And so, in order to make open source work well, you really need a robust market for support services.
Right.
And that's some place where the state could intervene by providing seed money to help get businesses going. It's an opportunity for entrepreneurship, et cetera. But that kind of support infrastructure needs to be in place, or nobody's going to do it, even if it's free.
Yeah, right. I mean, look, if we can do what we did with renewable energy, amen. I suspect we can probably do it with voting equipment and open source. But I interrupted you.
No, I apologize.
I just, at some point, we need to reconcile the fact that we have 58 counties doing something that affects the state. I was a county supervisor for 9 years in Alameda, and you didn't quite go out to the bus stop and get people to work on voter registration, but damn near. It was the least thought about. Supervisors, you would think that everybody would really care about this since it's your lifeblood. Wasn't the case. So we often, and then if you watched ballots being picked up, thrown in the back of a trunk, found 2 years later, it's like cold cases. I mean, we got to do that with just ballots.
Found floating in the bay.
Yeah, be 5-year series. I'm more and more persuaded, and part of it is because of Alex Padilla, because we now finally have a Secretary of State that gives a damn about the office. It's just not a place to raise money for the next office. I think it would behoove us to think about how much responsibility should we give the counties, or should they be creatures of state and implement a common system? And if we're not willing to spend money on that, shame on us. It's budget dust and all the stuff that we're doing. We're banning, flexible straws, paper this, paper that. We're doing a lot of really symbolic stuff, and yet the core we're not paying any attention to. And there's also some growing evidence that if it may not be the Russians, it may have been somebody else in outer space, but somebody was going in and manipulating the voter rolls to create a de facto purge of voter registrants. And at some point, I don't know how you protect against that, but it's clear that things were happening in certain counties and certain areas. And I think this state, since we'd like to think of ourselves as the tech, capital of the world, of the universe, and we are the leading progressives in the country, we ought to cop to this damn thing. And I think the Hoover Commission ought to be the one just acting as the spear of the sword, spear of the sword, tip of the spear. Yeah, I just finished reading David Silva's book, and so I'm getting all the cliches confused. But I do think of all the good information and recommendations that we have, we ought to be thinking in terms of the state better take charge of this damn thing. And I don't say that willy-nilly. But my own practical experience is frightening when I think about the way we've done things. And one other thing, when I was chairing the elections in whatever we call it, we call it reapportionment. We didn't call it redistricting. But when I was chairing that here a little while back, we had folks from Diebold come because they were the ones selling this ranked choice voting, which I know a little something about. And I said, well, how do I know? It's a black box as far as I'm concerned. Well, they were giving me its proprietary information. Well, that would be the end of it for me. You can't have something that's proprietary that you cannot tell me how it's functioning to count votes. And I was, again, surprised how quickly people just say, oh, I guess that's proprietary. So we got a long way to go, and unless we're going to hop to, we have lots of evidence right now to say get on this thing, because we wouldn't have this clown in Washington if we did. And we may not be able to get our own clown in there for a while. So anyway, I would like to suggest that'll be a centerpiece of where I am.
But respond just really briefly. So, we already at the state level could promulgate regulations around how the paper is handled, and it is already at the state level that equipment is certified. What we don't have is a uniform requirement. There's a menu of options, and I think that is appropriate. But we do need interoperability standards and data format standards, and those the EAC is working on, but hasn't happened yet. Ideally, we would have modular systems with good interoperability, but maybe John will talk about that.
If you want to have some fun, staff, in all 58 counties, it'd be interesting to know who the registrars are, what their qualifications are, how they got there. Because in Alameda County, I swear to God, we were just grabbing somebody and saying, well, what are you doing this week? Would you like to be the registrar? we had a vacancy and, no particular training. Now, the IT guy's running it now, which seems relatively appropriate. But when you say give them options, my antenna go up. What kind of options are you giving them? Because the Board of Supervisors ultimately will make that decision. The registrar will make a recommendation, and the board will verify it and promulgate it. And that's pretty frightening if you've been to board meetings.
And this is why we love you so much, Commissioner Prado. Mr. Sebes.
Well, may it please Chairman Nava and Vice Chairman Varner. My name's John Sebes. I'm a technology professional with over 35 years of experience, including cybersecurity, government computing, and for the last decade, election technology, with a particular focus on security. I'm the co-founder and the Chief Technology Officer of the Open Source Election Technology Institute, or OSET. We're a 501c3 public charity and a California public benefit corporation. Core of our work, developing election technology to fill the gap between what election officials need and what the current market is able to provide. And that certainly includes voting systems cybersecurity. OSET also has a significant scientific and educational mission that includes serving as a subject matter expert on election technology, especially cybersecurity, for a variety of government organizations and media. And I'm very, very pleased to be here today. Thank you. And a particular thanks to putting me up here with my colleague, Dr. Stark, who, as a result of him speaking, I can now say everything that he said, yes, and put that as a frame around what I say, which is a complementary topic. I'd like to start my remarks about voting technology by defining critical democracy infrastructure, which is something y'all asked us about. That's all the technology assets that are required for United States, state and local election officials to administer and to conduct elections. It includes voter records management, voter check-in, casting and counting ballots, managing the tabulation of election results, and more, all of which is critical infrastructure for three reasons. First, they've all been formally designated by the federal government. Election officials are now critical infrastructure operators. Second, these assets meet the definition of critical infrastructure being necessary for the operation of the processes that are critical to the nation, in this case, elections. Assets whose defense is a homeland security matter and whose threats are a national security matter. That's the definition. Number three, the homeland security and national security aspects have been amply illustrated by attacks by nation-state adversaries on our systems. So my written testimony says a whole lot more about the national security, homeland security aspects, critical democracy infrastructure. If you've read any of it, I'd be happy to take questions. A lot of the questions that were posed to me were about voting equipment security. So I'd like to address that question by narrowing down to the definition of what voting equipment is and what security is. And that's a distinct subset of the larger set of election infrastructure that I just briefly referred to. So we're focusing narrowly on the hardware and the software for two things. Okay, number one, the devices that voters and election officials use for casting and counting ballots and for managing the process of combining these devices' vote tally data into vote totals and election results. Okay, that's the mission critical element of a voting system, turning ballots into election results. As Phil said, there's an enormous amount of procedural aspect of that as well. I'm simply referring to the technology part of that. And the second component is election management systems that include the essential function of preparing these devices for operation in a specific election. Now, they also include a large number of ancillary functions that are not mission critical, not security critical, and they do create substantial and unnecessary risks. But that's what I'm going to comment on in terms of voting equipment and security, as you all asked. Now, the security for all these systems includes several types of security: cybersecurity, physical security, personnel security, procedural security, and more. The definition of voting equipment security also includes a definition of threats to be protected against. And the threat model of today must include the threats from nation-state adversaries, with the most sophisticated teams of cyber operatives working in concert with teams that conduct information operations, disinformation, and propaganda. Okay, so that's the world we live in, and my assessment is based on that. Let me also add that it's my belief, and that of many others in the national security and homeland security area, that the goals of our adversaries are perhaps only secondarily or less to fiddle with votes and influence election results. So when we talk about security voting systems, we really often over-focus on that. The principal objectives, I believe, are to disrupt and to discredit elections and undermine our democracy. Right. So for that, you need to actually consider the technical infrastructure as a risk, not just for bits being flipped inside computers and stuff like that, but also creating either the reality or the appearance of an insecure process whose evidence cannot be trusted. So, all right, but I'm going to depart from all that for the moment and focus just on cybersecurity. And that is the set of technical protection mechanisms that protect these assets from tampering and abuse. Cybersecurity includes protections from a variety of threats, hardware-level threats, threats to the system software, that is the platform for the actual voting software, threats to that voting software itself, technical threats from physical access, abuse of insider privilege, all of these things, if it's a computer or, a data storage device, there's technical threats to that. So, for voting system cybersecurity, the current status that y'all asked about is pretty straightforward. There is really currently no significant degree of technical protection of the voting machines and the EMS's hardware and software. The basic technology platform for them is 90s PC technology that lacks any of the cybersecurity technology that we would view, if I got my pages right, as typical for today's mission-critical systems, whether it's national security, defense, homeland security. As a result, at the technical level for cybersecurity, almost all voting equipment security today consists not of cybersecurity, but of several kinds of compensating physical and procedural controls, notably including cross-checks that include audits. So those are performed by local election staff. When I say those, I mean a variety of things, not just audits, keeping air-gapped systems air-gapped, training your staff not to respond to phishing, so on and so on. Many, many things are performed by local election staff who in most localities lack any training in critical infrastructure protection or cyber defense. So it's challenging. My written testimony has details on lots more of that stuff, and I'm, of course, happy to expand during questions. Now I'd like to turn to 4 questions about that you asked about nonprofit organizations, for-profit, proprietary, non-proprietary, and so forth. So what are the strengths and weaknesses of the for-profit model of voting equipment with respect to security? So existing commercial vendors are in the business of selling legacy technology that was not designed for cybersecurity and is wholly unsuitable as critical infrastructure. Okay? These products were invented in a different world. These vendors do not have the wherewithal to go back to the drawing board and create a wholly new generation of election technology that's designed for the current threat environment. But
what you're saying is they have a lot of lipstick.
Well, I'd prefer to be more charitable, being a former technology entrepreneur myself, and say that they're in a market that doesn't permit them large enough margins to have any R&D whatsoever. But their strength remains, and that is their ability to deliver voting system services and support for their products. And it's super important, right? As Phil said, and I'm sure others will say, our local election officials need not just technology but support and services, and in some ways the latter is more important. So how could a nonprofit model address those weaknesses? Well, essentially, by doing the technology development work that companies are not commercially motivated to do, especially with respect to cybersecurity. So the strength of non-commercial organizations is the lack of a profit motive, and hence the ability to develop technology that meets the needs that the market doesn't currently address. That's the strength. Okay? And the strength has been shown repeatedly with success of public technology organizations that support infrastructure technology, Linux, Android, MySQL, Apache, OpenSSL, more and more and more, all very, very widely used in government computing. Okay, so as a model, this is not something new or weird. It's actually standard. Okay, now, what are the weaknesses of the nonprofit model and what can be done to mitigate them? Well, non-commercial organizations have no capability for government-oriented system integration services to deliver technology and provide services and support. Now, I don't view that as a weakness per se, but as a recognition of the proper scope and mission. An essential aspect of the public technology development model is technology transfer, enabling commercial organizations to use non-proprietary technology to deliver solutions to government customers. It's super common at the federal level, also at the large state level here. At the federal level, it's actually almost the majority of system integration and technology delivery. So, in other words, the delivery model is unchanged for election technology as for so many other kinds of technology. Government organizations will continue to procure integration services and support from commercial companies. Is there a role for commercial companies in this model? Yes, emphatically. And it's not really a nonprofit model. Commercial companies will continue to be the source for election IT integration services and support, and that will be delivered via state and local governments' procurement processes that they use for election technology as in any other IT needs. And this is, as I said, common practice in other areas. Global, national, and regional IT companies have a substantial track record in delivering on procurements that include non-proprietary technology. And the existence of non-proprietary technology for elections can remove those companies' barriers to entry in the election market, aka more competition. You asked about some objections. What are objections most frequently heard from moving away from a for-profit model for voting equipment? We're not advocating for moving away from a for-profit model for voting equipment delivery, service, and support. We're not advocating for an open source model for that either, delivery, service, and support. What we are advocating for is a shift away from proprietary black box systems to a model of system integration and delivery of non-proprietary technology that was developed from the ground up for current needs. Those include the needs of our many counties, which vary, but also include needs in cybersecurity, and was developed for those needs for cybersecurity because of the strengths and weaknesses that I just described now. That's what we're advocating for. Okay. Objections. The most frequent objections are based on a real misunderstanding of what the word open source means in 57 different contexts, and really significant misunderstandings of how non-proprietary technology has worked in government computing for decades. Okay. So an attachment to my written testimony is a white paper that provides as complete an assessment as we could come up with at OSET of all the common objections and misperceptions and how they don't apply to critical government computing. And I believe elections are critical government computing. So this is not about trying to disrupt a commercial industry or whatever, but really trying to revitalize it and open it for more competition with the technology that, frankly, it just needs and doesn't have. You asked when might it make sense for county election officials to design and build their own voting systems. Well, I think the starting point for that is a recognition at the county level, perhaps with some input from state requirements, guidelines, frameworks, a recognition that a county may not be able to procure a voting system that it needs from the existing commercial vendors. Some counties will say yes, some counties may say, some counties have said no. So it begins with that. You asked about LA County. Kenneth will say plenty about that. I don't need to say much. But LA County's situation is somewhat unique because of a few factors. They did not adopt any of this early 21st century voting technology that's now being replaced. They wisely stewarded their funds, both HAVA and state, for a really big project that they're doing now. They were able to develop already their own in-house election management system, so they've been able to focus now on the voting devices, critically the ballot marking device. And that's all great, but that's probably not the starting point for a lot of other counties. San Francisco also has made a commitment to non-proprietary voting technology in principle, but they're really only just emerging from the study phase. So we know ranked choice voting is important to San Francisco. Not really sure what the scope of their overall efforts will be going forward. We'll have to see. When might it make sense for a county election official to work with an organization like mine? I think especially for California's smaller counties, it might be expedient to participate in existing projects that create non-proprietary technology, and probably to focus on some individual voting system components, not the whole enchilada, right? But it's individual voting system components that meet the needs that are common to several counties, and notably, and can take advantage of California's ability to create a voting system certification process that includes non-proprietary technology and can be tuned to the county's needs. And that's, among other things, SB 360, and many thanks to now Secretary Padilla for spearheading that. I have some other recommendations, and I'm grateful to have been asked about other recommendations, and I'm afraid I took up a lot of ink in my written testimony on those, so I'll try to be brief and stick to a theme. My theme is that California should continue and expand its role as a state laboratory for innovation that can be followed nationwide in the area of election technology, cybersecurity testing, and certification. And I'm going to list a few areas where California can lead. It's not all of them. And these areas are specific to the area of my testimony. My colleagues have also said things that I fully support as areas where California can continue to invest, innovate, and lead. But from my list, there are several areas of activity. One is define individually certifiable voting system components that are mission critical and security critical and meet California's needs, especially those of smaller counties, such as ballot scanning counting devices and tabulation management devices. So focus on individual things that we know our officials need and that we can do the technology development, testing, and certification at a much smaller focused scale. Number two, assist in accelerated completion of federal data interoperability standards and adopting them as requirements for certification in California of any voting system, whether it's the big monolithic systems today or individual components that can interoperate via those standards. Data standards are really boring. I'm grateful for Phil nodding his head. It's a prerequisite for having real non-proprietary systems. And it's going slowly at the federal level. Some effort from the state level of California to participate in that voluntary activity could really accelerate it and also help it meet California's needs more specifically. Number three, adding to the California certification process, the use of existing federal and military cybersecurity assessment and certification programs. And again, apply those to individual voting system components with California-specific requirements. I mean, start here, start local. I bring that up because there are an enormous number of high-security, mission-critical systems that have been engineered to be highly robust against nation-state adversaries, mostly paid for by the federal government, and we have a testing and certification program that's specific for cybersecurity, and it's effective. It's not used at the state level in any election system at all, and as I'm sure some of my colleagues present here today can attest, the lack of a cybersecurity focus in the certification process has led to systems that when we assessed them in California here in the top to bottom review, found systems that were, I'll be blunt, from a security perspective, were kind of a disaster.
Well, that's probably why they don't want to apply them. I mean, why would you take a test if you know you're going to fail?
Because it's required for the privilege of selling your product in the state of California.
Okay.
Yeah. As a model for other states, lead with statewide standard processes for the procedural elements of election integrity, especially for county-level risk-limiting audits of paper ballots, supervised by the state for compliance with state requirements for procedures and published results. Now, I'm echoing what my colleagues have said, but I do want to stress that there's an interplay between technology and procedure here that needs to be very, very well defined for our county election officials to have this job specified for them in an actionable and specific way. And it's not enough to tell our county election officials to do these processes. We need to give them those processes, and we need to provide some oversight to make sure that they're done right. You know, that might actually include some funding for training and operating these processes that are essential. I mean, I've advocated for dramatically increased cybersecurity of voting systems, but that's never going to make them perfect, and we always have to cross-check the work of the computers. And then finally, commit to, fund, and lead a mission to develop and make available a new platform of publicly owned, non-proprietary election technology, possibly in a multi-state compact, but certainly focused on the full range of needs of California's counties. My written testimony has details of costs, methods, range of organizations that could carry out this work. And before closing, I do want to again reiterate my view that everything that I've said here is complementary to those of my colleagues. We always must really not trust and always verify any computers that we use for critical functions. But it's not enough to say, well, we have these very vulnerable systems, and if somebody messes with them, we'll be able to catch it with a ballot audit and all will be well. All will not be well, because the disrupting and discrediting of our elections will be proceeding apace. So we have to strengthen our systems to be both visibly and truly more robust, and also remain vigilant over them. So on behalf of the OSET Institute, I thank the chair, vice chair, the entire commission, those watching remotely, and the entire commission for considering our contributions here and your further understanding of these issues. And I look forward to addressing your questions today. Thank you.
Questions?
I just have questions on the economics of this, and I'm intrigued by this statewide project and having a statewide platform that can be utilized on a county level. If I'm correct, and I don't know if I am, in the past decade or so, there's been about $600 million that has been spent on voting equipment and things. And I have no idea where that money went and why we're at where we are today, having spent that kind of money. And then we have the governor's budget includes $134.3 million for this same thing going forward. I don't know. I mean, we're at the Little Hoover Commission. We're about efficiency and accountability. I have no idea, and I didn't look into the budget to see exactly how that's going to be accounted for and how the county's sharing that. You have indicated in here that you roughly think that that this project will be a 2-year initiative, about $40 million cost. And then you list the potential contributors and supporters of this. So that $40 million, I'm just curious, is that $40 million, is that from your perspective an expectation of a state expenditure, or is this something that these potential contributors would contribute to that cost?
Those contributors would be performers for a funded effort for technology development, so performers, not contributors. Okay. Where the money comes from is a separate issue. I mentioned a multi-state compact. That's something we've discussed with the Secretary of State's office in the past. Some folks in other states, besides California, have a similar interest. So I wanted to put those numbers out there to give an idea for the order of magnitude that's required for the technology work to take all the existing components of cybersecurity that have been applied to a number of other critical systems, put them together with the functionality that California's counties need, and arrive at a technology base that can then be used in that model that I described earlier, which is procurement of system integration services to customize, deliver, service, and support the technology for voting systems that each county needs. That's a pretty good estimate to give you the right number of digits that's required.
May I interject? We haven't compared notes on where those numbers came from. I would have come up with a figure more in the sort of $20 to $30 million range, but it's the right number, the same number of digits.
Yes.
And again, that's to develop sort of the intellectual property to be owned by the public, that would then support voting systems that are largely based on commodity hardware. It's not for the acquisition of the hardware itself, but this, I think, could probably divide current hardware costs by 4, maybe,
at least, yeah. I mean,
easily, and probably divide support costs by a comparable number. So given what these systems cost to replace, and given that the time is ripe to do it with new federal money coming in, et cetera, it really seems like a no-brainer. I mean, an investment would save an enormous amount of money within a year or two.
Well, actually, Phil, you and I are on even closer to the same page than you think. The somewhat higher number that I quoted also includes development of testing material, documentation, and so forth to support a certification process. You can't just show up with code and say, here, give it a test.
And you probably want to seed some small businesses to be in the support business, and so on. So some money to
But the order of magnitude, I think, is really the thing that you're after.
Is that in the hands? That would be in the hands of the Secretary of State?
If the state of California chooses to fund this solely by itself and task the Secretary of State with dispersing these funds, sure.
But a coalition of local election officials could do it as well, and there's no reason that it needs to be limited to California. The requirements are comparable in most places, even though most ballots are simpler than ours.
Well, the problem obviously is urgency. The more you engage others, the longer it takes to come in a common position.
Indeed.
So, but it sounds like Mr. Padilla has been engaged with you, or
We've had meetings with he and his staff periodically, and as well as with folks in other states. So we're as part of our public service advocacy, role, we're trying to connect the dots with multiple states that might have a common interest and might make common cause together. Wow, I'm so glad I nailed the cybersecurity issue down flat that there's nothing else to say.
the benefit of not knowing anything.
Well, if you need some help falling asleep, there's piles of stuff with my written testimony.
Yeah.
So.
Well, one of the best parts of humor is self-deprecating humor, and I think that we really do recognize and appreciate the contribution that you brought to this hearing, because when we talk about open source and proprietary, and what I'm encouraged by is, I think, the profound sense of importance that you both have articulated with the notion of democracy and these parts of it that have to be in place and that have to be respected and that have integrity, so that the ideals that we all subscribe to can continue to go forward. And this conversation is, I think, critically important, particularly now. And I want to thank you both.
And neither one of you are a pinhead, so that really matters. Yeah. No, it's being able to talk in terms that, and after I read it, I'd have to read it twice or three times. I haven't gotten that far. But, you make a compelling case that I think the average elected official or decision maker could understand and agree to.
Sure hope so.
It is kind of curious that we've spent, let's say there's 135 or 34 million in the budget now, so we're heading towards $1 billion, and the question is, what happened to that money? Because you're really you're coming in with a number that probably no one's thought about, because of our stuff is additive, if it's, and I think the idea of the most damning thing you said was, we're now doing things that were started in the 90s and that didn't work much then, and that's, that is an indictment of our system, and it's an indictment of those of us who have been responsible, myself included. So I appreciate your candor.
Most welcome, sir and ma'ams.
Thank you. Thank you. Next panel, please.
Next, we will hear the county perspective on voting equipment security. Kammi Foote serves as the Inyo County Clerk-Recorder, and Kenneth Bennett is the program manager for voting solutions of all people in the Los Angeles County Clerk-Recorder's office. Thank you so much.
There's two extremes, right? Inyo and L.A.
It was deliberate.
Exactly. That's right. So first of all, I want to thank you for the invitation to testify and for having this really important hearing. I think that this is something that we've been discussing at the national level for the last couple of years, and I'm really excited to see that the Little Hoover Commission is taking on this topic. Just to give you a little background on Inyo County, if you have never been or you're not familiar, Inyo County is the second largest county geographically in the state of California. It takes 5 hours to drive from one end to the other. We have the highest and lowest points in the continental U.S., which is Death Valley and Mount Whitney. During a summer June primary, I have areas of my county that exceed 120 degrees. And in a November general election, I have other areas of the county that are under 5 feet of snow. We also have about 10,000 registered voters, so approximately 1 voter per square mile. We're very dispersed, very rural, and yes, very different than the Los Angeles urban voting experience. The last thing I want to say about Inyo County specifically, we also have 5 federally recognized Native American tribal governments. This is a population, the only population that I'm aware of that must maintain 2 separate voter registration databases in order to vote in every election that they're eligible. So we do, a lot of our advocacy efforts are focused on that population to ensure that they're not disenfranchised in voting in federal elections. A little bit about me specifically. I was just re-elected to my 3rd term of office. I did have a background as a poll worker before I came into the office, so I have boots on the ground experience there for about a decade. Are you a native to Inyo? I am. I grew up in the Owens Valley in Inyo County. Inyo County does have a small staff. I have the unique honor and privilege of overseeing 3 divisions of county government, one of which is elections. I have 1 staff member allocated to help me with all the laws, statutes, and procedures that go along with that. And to give you an idea about some of what that entails, candidate filing, programming election counting software, maintaining the voter registration database, outreach, designing balloting materials, overseeing election mailings, recruiting and training polling place workers, and counting and certifying the vote. And of course, this includes keeping your vote secure all the way end to end. So very small staff. I oversee pretty much every single aspect of elections in Inyo County, California. For the past 7 years, neither the state of California nor the federal government has paid for any portion of the cost to administer elections. That's all done at the county level. I will say there's some reimbursement for postage, but it's very small in Inyo County, in the hundreds, that they would do that. As previous people have testified.
I want to ask a question. You, in the California, you're required to put a postage stamp on your the ballot.
Yes and no. There's a new law that just passed that's going to require it, beginning I think 2019, maybe 2020. But I will say for the past more than a decade, if you mail your ballot without a stamp, it gets delivered.
That's what I was. It's interesting that we create something that's almost patently illegal. We're using. It's like a poll tax.
It is, in a sense. I've heard that used, but I will say any ballot that's currently mailed and for the past decade, if you don't put a stamp on it, it still gets.
Wouldn't you think that even under a new law you'd do that?
Well, we are now.
Yeah.
Yes. Absolutely. As previous people have testified, a voting system is made up of a package, hardware, software, and logistics, each of which needs to work in careful coordination with the other components to operate as intended. There's a lot of focus here on the cybersecurity aspect, but there's definitely the physical security and the logistics that need to be taken into consideration. Some of the things that Inyo County has done since 2016, we've purchased a new voting system that is both Wi-Fi disabled and not connected to the internet. You hear a lot that our voting systems here are not connected to the internet, but you may have read recently a report about some voting system vendors having some remote access. I personally went into the BIOS and disabled the Wi-Fi of all of our equipment in Inyo County. We've also joined the Multi-State Information Security and Analysis Center and the Election Infrastructure Information Security and Analysis Center, known as MSISEC and EIISEC. I get emails daily on cybersecurity intrusions happening across the United States so that we're able to respond to those if necessary. I've also contracted with the Department of Homeland Security to receive their no-cost services. Well, they're paid for by federal tax dollars, but no additional cost to us. These include cyber hygiene vulnerability scans, a risk and vulnerability assessment, and a phishing campaign assessment. Department of Homeland Security was on site in Inyo County on the 17th of this month, and so I'm really looking forward to continuing to work with them to be able to shore up the things that we need to in Inyo County.
Just let me mention something. Sorry for the interruption, but this goes to Commissioner Parada's point about qualifications of people like yourself who have these positions that are so important. And it really is an interesting question, I think, for staff to find out whether there's any consistency county to county with people who hold the kind of position that you do, because you've obviously taken a deep interest in being current, not just being current, but being ahead of those things that are coming in your direction, and you take your job very seriously, and for that you should be complimented. But I also think that part of what we need to know as the commission is, how are the other counties encouraging their officials in your capacity to learn all that they can and to be as proactive as you are?
That is a good question. I do think we have a strong statewide association. All but 16 of us are elected to this position, and so it really is the initiative of the registrar as to whether or not they're going to go in depth. I would say that all of my colleagues that I work with, I think they take this issue very seriously, and I think that they try to tackle these issues similarly along the lines of what I'm doing. I think what I would like to express, and I have a few other things that we've done, but what I would like to express here is that Inyo County is one of the smallest counties in California, and we're able to do all of these things. So every county in California should be able to accomplish what we've been able to accomplish, even with the limited funding that we have. But I will get into funding in just a moment. I also want to let you know that we've upgraded our election systems website to HTTPS. I've initiated the process of purchasing Albert, which is a network monitoring solution that provides automated alerts on both traditional and advanced network threats. I've completed one online cybersecurity course, and I'm in the process of completing a second one through MIT, which Alex Halderman has generously allowed it to be online for free. Anybody who wants to do that, you can pay $49.95 and get a certificate, or you can at least just get the knowledge with no additional cost, which is pretty amazing. And I began the process to secure funding to enhance our physical security. The state of California has been helpful in providing links to services, but the state itself has not offered any on-site assessments, funding, or other material support as of this time. To go to, is it Vice Chairman Varner's comment about the $134 million? That has yet to reach the county level. The money that was first allocated back in 2002, both with the Help America Vote Act and Prop 41 funds, went to purchase equipment. I believe LA County might be one of the ones that are holding on to most of their money, which I don't want to speak for LA County. I think they're going to be allocating to this new VSAP project some of it. But if you can imagine trying to use your laptop from 10 or 15 years ago, that's because that's basically what voting systems are. They're computers. And so those computers that were purchased with those funds back between 2002 and 2006 primarily are obsolete. We call them our legacy equipment.
Have you heard anything about the $34 million from the federal government that's coming to California for cybersecurity and how that might be allocated?
Not yet. I have sent an email to Susan Lapsley, who you will hear from on the next panel. She did let me know that it's forthcoming, but we have not received any allocation, or that money has not been made available to counties yet either. So right now, we were able to purchase our new voting system in December of 2017 because I set up basically a sinking fund, a layaway, if you will, and I've asked my board and advocated my board of supervisors every year over the last 5 years to put money in there until we had enough to purchase. And that's the way that we were able to do it. I know some counties are still using their legacy equipment. They just don't have the money to buy the new systems yet. So what can California do right now to help counties secure election systems? Funding. You heard it from every person on this panel. It's true. As discretionary funding continues to dwindle at the local level, funding will continue to be our biggest challenge for securing our elections. I think election officials like to say we could have the most secure elections in the entire world if only we had the money to do it. There's definitely technology out there. Counties don't have a lot of funds to take advantage of it. Development of open source voting systems. You've had a lot of questions about that. I'm a big proponent of it. The state could incentivize the development, procurement, and use of open source software in vote tabulation systems. We've talked about the many different benefits, but I would like to go into a little bit of the lock-in situation and what vendor lock-in and what that means from a county system. I have a good working relationship with my voting system vendors, so I don't want to seem this as negative, but what happens is I just purchased this new system. I'm locked in for 8 years with this vendor. If legislation in California changes all the time, if there's upgrades to the system that needs to be made, the voting system vendor may or may not be able to invest, depending on what it is. Like, for instance, when Prop 14 happened, the top two, our voting system vendor provided a human workaround to be able to report accurately, but that legacy system was never modified because the certification is quite expensive and lengthy, and it wasn't worth it for this vendor to be able to do that, knowing that there was a human workaround that wasn't perfect but was okay. So that's just one example. What vendor lock-in the situation is, customers are dependent on a single supplier for a product and cannot move to another vendor without substantial cost or inconvenience. If I wanted to go to another vendor, I have to purchase a whole new voting system. Lock-in tends to raise costs substantially, reduces long-term value, including functionality, innovation, and reliability, and can become a serious security problem since the supplier has little incentive to provide a secure product in a regulatory environment that does not allow vendors to quickly fix problems. So when we talk about security, and as you've heard other panelists mention, it has to be at the certification level, and that's the Secretary of State. Those standards have to be built in so that any voting system that comes onto the market for us to purchase already has the cybersecurity and whatever other system needed in there. I would say open source is a huge part of that. And that needs to be done at the state level.
Right. So I mean, thinking about this as a former legislator and having the Honorable Don Parada with us, thinking from the perspective of part of the certification process might, you have to flesh this out, be that vendors, in order to deal with the issue of the 8-year lock-in, contracts have to provide the ability or the requirement that when circumstances change, that's part of what is contracted for. Otherwise, you have what you're confronted with. And I just, as an aside, listening to you and what you're doing, I mean, I just looked it up. Inyo County is 18,260 people. I mean, they're lucky to have you. and I just wondered, did you bring any bread from Schatz by any chance?
I thought about it.
Yeah,
but
okay.
I didn't. I'm sorry.
All right, so pardon the interruption.
That's all right. I just have a few more things that I would like to say, if the commission would indulge me. I believe the state of California can help us with developing best practices specific to each voting system that they certify. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, known as NIST, they're going through updating their voluntary voting system guidelines. I will underscore voluntary. We refer to these as the VVSG. The problem with this is that a lot of election officials, registrars, we're not technologists, so to be able to look through all of those guidelines and extrapolate just the things that we need for our specific voting system can be a little onerous. So if the state of California can put aside some funds to be able to do that, that would help us adopt those voluntary guidelines to secure our systems. Other states have funded election monitoring systems, such as Albert, which I mentioned before, for their election jurisdictions. California could help secure elections by funding these monitoring programs for all of their counties like they do in other states. California can offer cybersecurity courses or at least promote them, just like the one in MIT. There's no additional cost. I spend a few hours every single week looking over important election security information and informing myself. Anybody can do that. And then finally, California can adopt more robust election audits. You heard a lot about risk-limiting audits. I don't think I need to go necessarily into it. You have my written testimony that I did conduct a pilot risk-limiting audit earlier this year, and I just got back from the state of Colorado. I was blessed to be able to be invited out there and observe the risk-limiting audit in 3 counties, Denver, Weld, and Jefferson. Denver has a population of over 693,000 people. All of their risk-limiting audits were completed in less than 8 hours. It was very efficient, and I think one of the byproducts that really was just something that I appreciated was you have to really shore up your ballot tracking system, your audit logs. You have to make sure that you know where every single ballot is, and make sure every ballot is accounted for in order to do the risk-limiting audit. And so just by instituting the risk-limiting audit requirement, it's going to enhance the physical security of the entire system because you have to know where those ballots are. And right now election officials know where they are, but maybe not to the extent that they would with a risk-limiting audit requirement. So the last thing I want to mention, I don't know that I mentioned it in my written testimony, but I think it's really important to bring up because I feel like one of the issues that we're suffering from as election officials, legislators, staff, commissioners, is that we're human, and we are, I believe a lot of us are suffering from the same ailments that are plaguing American society, which is this huge polarization and divisiveness. The chairman mentioned earlier that there's like 2 different Americas happening right now, And so I feel like with election security, this is not a partisan issue, but it gets wrapped up in partisanship too often. And so we need to figure out a way that we can talk about these issues in a way that is not seen as partisan. We need to be able to speak up and speak our mind when we see something that's not appropriate, because often what I see is minority opinions are seen as dissent, that pointing out different experiences and viewpoints is often seen as not being a team player, and that being transparent with the public and media about our vulnerabilities is often regarded as subversion or putting down another county or agency, and that's just not what it should be. We all have a vested interest in making sure that our elections are secure, that when you cast your vote for Canada Day, it gets counted for Canada Day, and we need to figure out an environment that we can work together to create that and make it happen.
You were not one of the 5 all-male counties, not MAIL counties.
No, we were not, but we are about 70% vote by mail currently, just by voter choice.
So you'd see no problem with having it at 100%?
I think voters like choices, especially our voters who've been voting for many years.
People like me.
I don't think that they would embrace a forced vote by mail. And there's actually evidence that when you require people to only vote by mail, that there could be, that could dissuade people from voting. If you give them options and they vote how they want to, I think that's the best way.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Bennett.
Chairman Nava, Vice Chairman Varner, and Commissioners, my name is Kenneth Bennett. I am the program manager for Los Angeles County's new voting system program. It's called the Voting Solutions for All People. I'm in my 15th year working for the Los Angeles County Registrar of Voters, primarily. Excuse me? Oh, yeah. Well, exactly. It is interesting. I thought that was intentional, actually, that you had both of us up here to kind of get the outliers. So I'm in my 15th year. I've worked primarily with voting system technology and election systems for the county, managing those systems and managing development of those systems. On behalf of Dean Logan, our Registrar-Recorder County Clerk, who really wanted to be here but could not make it, and the County of Los Angeles, I want to thank you for the opportunity to participate in this hearing and to provide Los Angeles County's perspective on our voting solutions for all people and voting system security. In many respects, Los Angeles County's approach to voting system security is no different than any other county in California. As Kammi aptly pointed out, we are all operating according to the same legal mandates, voting system standards and regulations, and we are participating in the same California Association of Clerks and Election Recorders, collaborating with the Secretary of State, doing additional work with DHS. All of these things are things that we're doing, and just like all the other counties, we take security and integrity of elections extremely seriously. What distinguishes Los Angeles County in the state and around the nation is our scale. I provided a lot of the stats for you. I won't repeat those there right now, but suffice it to say that by every measure, the volume of ballots, the count of voters, the number of languages, the variations of ballot styles, the number and distribution of voting locations, the amount of equipment, the level of staffing, the duration of work, et cetera, the administration of elections in the County of Los Angeles is challenging and complex from a technical, procedural, logistical, and budgetary perspective. This scale creates an environment where voting system security rubs up against other important voting system principles such as performance, accessibility, usability, transparency, and cost effectiveness. Our goal, as is I think the goal of all election administrators, is to maximize each of these principles as much as we can, but competing principles, and they do compete, can create constraints that require us to find the right balance between those principles and to prioritize pragmatism over idealism. For the implementation of our voting system, our voting solutions for all people, It is in this context that Los Angeles County approaches voting system security. The county has gone to great lengths to design and develop a voting solution that meets expectations for security shared by election administrators and election integrity advocates, including my colleagues presenting to you here today. The VSAP is a publicly owned open source voting solution that supports software independence using a voter-verified paper ballot and enables ballot-level auditing, as has been discussed here earlier. It implements security features such as air-gap networks and enterprise digital signing. Threat modeling and security planning have been at the core of the program from the beginning. The development environment is following the National Institute of Standards and Technology guidelines for security of facilities, systems, networks, and data. The solution is being developed following test-driven development principles aligned with security and other requirements of the California Voting System Standards and the Election Assistance Commission's Voluntary Voting System Guidelines. Regarding supply chain security concerns you asked about, all contracted staff with access to the county's VSAP intellectual property are fully vetted through a comprehensive background check process and have signed confidentiality agreements. Most importantly, final hardware assembly and all production software development and installation is required to be carried out within the United States. As a publicly owned open technology solution in the public trust, the county also advocates an iterative approach to certification testing in the belief that frequent testing will surface compliance issues earlier in the development cycle and will result in a more secure and more compliant solution. Los Angeles County has also developed an implementation strategy to progressively test the solution in the deployed environment through vote center test labs, a mock election, and where possible, an election pilot. The county will practice deployment processes and procedures and test the functionality and security of the solution. Moreover, the county plans to engage third-party organizations to help identify and mitigate any security risks, and the county would welcome ideas and support from the state of California in this effort. In addition to the considerable cost of implementing technologies and processes that better support voting system security, which Kammi already noted, there are other logistical constraints that make the implementation of security a challenge in Los Angeles County. For example, and this is something that you asked about, while Los Angeles County wholeheartedly agrees with the principles and value of conducting risk-limiting audits to confirm the integrity of elections and the correctness of results, and indeed the VSAP solution supports risk-limiting audits. It provides for the unique identification of ballots, and we actually process millions of them, this solution will allow us to get down to an individual paper ballot. But putting the theory of risk-limiting audits into practice in Los Angeles County, I'm not speaking on behalf of other counties right now, in Los Angeles County, putting it into practice encounters major obstacles with respect to the retrieval of and handling of paper ballots, the accuracy of hand counting, potentially millions of paper ballots, coordinating audit activities across jurisdictional boundaries, and for Los Angeles County in particular, the completion of the audit within the legal deadlines is a major challenge. And I know there's been a lot of discussion with a lot of people involved in risk-limiting audits about how we can do this, and I know those discussions are ongoing, and we want to continue to have those. Los Angeles County has proposed alternative methods for implementing risk-limiting audits, including using digital images of the ballot for the audit, backed up if need be by optional or perhaps random confirmation of the paper ballot, as well as conducting the risk-limiting audit on Los Angeles County's election night set of ballots. Los Angeles County believes there are ways to effectively validate the fidelity of ballot images and to use them responsibly for auditing purposes. These proposals would help streamline and control the ballot review process and better manage the cost and duration of the audit. Again, I want to emphasize, I'm talking about Los Angeles County, where a risk-limiting audit that could potentially result in a 100% manual count could involve millions of ballots, and in the case of our new vote-by-mail ballot, this is going to be a multi-card ballot. So if you have 1 or 2 million vote by mail ballots returned, you're talking about potentially 3, 4, 5 million pieces of paper that you have to work.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to get like a sense of the scale that you were talking about. So, for example, in the last gubernatorial primary, how many ballots were cast in LA County?
I don't have that number off the top of my head. I want to say, well, I'll have to get that for you. I don't have the stats. It's
I can Google
at least 1 to 2 million.
Okay, so 1 to 2 million. And then, with respect to paper ballots, how many paper ballots are generated, for example, during the primary? Are there 1 to 2 million paper ballots as well?
All our ballots are always paper. So we only have paper ballots. But right now, the county, our current system, the system we have right now, InkaVote, it's one card per voter. So a voter gets 1 card. In the future system, depending on how they vote, voting on a ballot marking device in a vote center would yield 1 card. So they still have that 1 to 1 ratio. But for vote by mail ballots, in order to lay out the type of ballot styles that we have in the county and the number of contests we usually have, you're talking about 3 or 4 or 5, potentially 5 cards to lay that out, and so that's the multiplier.
And storage facilities, how are the ballots stored?
Well, for the future system, for the VSAP, we're still trying to figure that out. That's a critical aspect of the implementation that we're in the process of assessing right now. The one thing that we're giving up with our current system, as deficient as it is, as we've noted, and I think other people have noted, this InkaVote is essentially a modified form of the original punch card. The value in that is it's an extremely small footprint, and we can store for the 2008 general election when Obama was elected president. There were over 3 million ballots cast in the county, and we can store all of those. We were able to store all of those ballots in a 5,000 square foot tally room where our tally equipment is as well. There's no way we're going to be able to do that in the future system. And so that's something we sacrifice, though, for the sake of the benefits of the future system.
Yeah, see, because I think these kinds of questions most people don't give any consideration to. I mean, just the logistics of storing the ballots, and then as we talk about on the auditing, and as lawyers, in the chain of custody issues, how do you protect the integrity of that, and then the cost for storage, and then feeling secure that the employees who are responsible for protecting the material that's stored are the right people for doing that stuff.
Absolutely. I mean, those are all issues that we face. I mean, the truth of the matter is in Los Angeles County, when you're talking about an operation as large as the conduct of an election in LA County, it's hard to get away from processes that are very manual, involve a lot of people, and all those people need to be trained in different things, because it's in an operation of our scale, people tend to be more specialized, as opposed to maybe in Kammi's operation, it's a handful of people that do sort of everything. So it's a very different approach to it, and yeah, it's extremely challenging to run operations at that scale and to make sure that the staff are trained.
So you mentioned the lawyerly question. As a business lawyer, I like to put deals together, but sometimes I also have to be a paid pessimist.
Yeah.
And so one of the things as I'm reading your testimony that came to mind, and Chairman Nava sort of alluded to it, is the integrity of the process. So in here you've indicated that you have 2 election workers per vote center minimum, and then they handle also as well transportation of the ballots. So how are those people chosen? And I'm just curious, and I don't know, it may be just logistically, you've got to rely on the fact that these people have gone through a educational process, they've been trained, and then they've signed confidentiality agreements and all that. But is there a process by which you pick those 2 people, or how does that work?
Well, and the 2 people I was referring to in my testimony was when ballots are transported back from the voting location to the collection facility where we collect all the ballots and then send them back for central count. Voting locations have much more than 2 people. And it's, depending on the election, it's easier harder to recruit those poll workers. They all have to go through training, or at least most of them go through training, and we incentivize that training. They don't sign confidentiality agreements. They do sign some sort of affidavit as a poll worker, but it's not a confidentiality agreement. And we also have what we call a inspector that's kind of a supervisor who is trained at a higher level and is expected to kind of manage the voting location and make sure that it operates according to procedures.
So the integrity of the system and allowing people who have maybe dissenting viewpoints feel comfortable that their vote was cast the way that they vote. Is there a partisan basis to that as to how that works, or is it a nonpartisan? How do you vet those two people from the standpoint of picking the two?
Well,
and even from a location perspective, the demographics of the location and the minority basis there.
Well, yeah, and consideration for political affiliation's not a factor in recruiting poll workers, and I think there's maybe Kammi can speak to it more, but because that's not my area of specialization in the county, but certainly rules of conduct, and there's electioneering laws, and there's things that govern how people of different political perspectives are intended to behave in the polling place. But as far as the integrity, we are relying on the integrity of volunteers to do the right thing. There is monitoring, there's training. So, I don't know if there's anything else to add to that. But
do you mind if I add to that? I know we're very different jurisdictions, so we probably have a different recruiting process. But in Inyo County, they're all volunteers. There is state law that requires that we publish who our volunteers are and their political preference on our website. And up until recently, it was required to be published in the newspaper, which our poll workers didn't appreciate very much. But but it's still on the website. There's no requirement that it be politically diverse. There are similar requirements in other states that there has to be, someone from each party. But really, volunteer poll workers are becoming harder and harder to come by. When we have the comment about someone at the bus stop, I've literally had to do that on election day when we've had volunteer poll workers not show up even after training, going into the coffee shops or wherever and just saying, does anybody want to volunteer for elections today? I want to swear you in and train you and put you to work, because really volunteerism across all spectrums is declining. Your service clubs are declining. It's just, I don't know what it is, but it is going to continue to be a challenge to recruit volunteer poll workers. If we did have some kind of partisan requirement, it might make it even a little more difficult.
So a couple more points to make. I wanted to get back to the risk limiting audit. I think, again, Los Angeles County wholeheartedly agrees with the principles and the value. I think what we're struggling with is how we implement that. And in many cases, I know that the examples we've had from Colorado and some of the pilots that we've done here would also bear out the same in Los Angeles County for contests that are small, small jurisdictions, and if the turnout, depending on the turnout, and the spread in the vote, you could do conduct a risk limiting audit using the paper ballot the way it's intended. But if it scales for whatever reason, that's the part that we're really challenged by, and being able to do that, being able to recruit the people to do it, be able to run the processes, even if the system supports it, because the VSAP solution will support it. It's just how can we scale up that operation in a way that does inspire the confidence. And actually, I would push back a little bit on what was said earlier about, yes, a hand count is the legal definition of who won, but that, we all know from the 2000 presidential election that there was a lot of scrutiny about that process and how accurate it really was. And so, just because it's the legal definition doesn't mean it's necessarily inspiring confidence. And so we have some concerns about, when we all know that human beings don't count very long, very well, and that's a challenge. And so, again, when a small number of ballots achieves that statistical confirmation of the election results, that's great. 2 thumbs up. We're in support of that. But when it escalates to 2 to 3 million ballots for a countywide election, it's a completely different concept. And I think we want to make sure we understand how that would work, how it would impact our operations, our costs, and also how we could get it done on time. Because, we have 30 days to do the canvass, and there are many jurisdictions that are relying on that canvass and those results being certified in that time period in order to do their job.
It just occurred to me, and I want to apologize for the level of ignorance, but we're talking about Los Angeles County elections. Within the county, there are numerous cities. When cities have elections, who's responsible for preparing those ballots and getting them to voters and then counting them?
Well, for quite some time, many of the cities held their own elections, conducted their own elections, and most of them, except for, I believe, Long Beach and the city of Los Angeles, actually contracted out those services to a private vendor, Martin & Chapman. Since it was I'm not forgetting the name of the law, but when law passed to have cities migrate over to the county elections, that's happening very quickly.
So the cities pay the county?
Yes.
The contract with the county?
Yes, basically.
But before that, they were private?
Well, it was optional. So
optional.
The city could either contract with the county or not. I think some of the issues. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why that happened. One is the punch card ballots had a limited number of contests you could run on. In Los Angeles County, I think there was a sense that maybe there was a limit to our ballot capacity. That might be why I think many counties already have cities that have already migrated years ago before this law was even enacted. But in Los Angeles County, it was beneficial in some respects to have those cities run their elections in off years or at different times.
Right.
But now with the new system, we're not going to have that capacity constraint, so we'll be able to do that for them.
Yeah, thank you.
I just wanted to conclude my remarks about the RLA here. What I wanted to say was we're advocating that we think through this a little bit more, and rather than just rejecting out of principle some of the concepts that we've proposed, that we encourage all the stakeholders in the process, election integrity advocates, other election administrations, this commission, the Secretary of State, to support further research and confirmation of the processes involved in RLA and the associated technologies before determining what is really adequate in terms of effective, efficient, and appropriate RLA process. The county has advocated for legislation that defines principles and objectives for RLA, but leaves to regulation the fine details of how and when to conduct such an audit. And so, for example, maybe there's circumstances under which digital ballot images are permissible when you're actually approaching a scale where that makes sense with appropriate checks and things like that, checks of the paper ballot. I wanted to address lastly the discussion around open source, because there's been a lot of discussion of it, and the VSAP solution's been brought up in this context. I wanted to make it clear to the commission, it is the intent of Los Angeles County to allow the solution as an open technology in the public trust to be shared with other jurisdictions who are interested in adopting it, either in whole or in part. It is possible, for example, to adopt just the software and not the hardware, or vice versa, and it is possible to adopt just one component of the solution. I don't think the county has any particular interest in sort of mandating it. I mean, as proud of the VSAP solution as we are, I don't think we would leave that up to individual election jurisdictions to decide whether they wanted to do that. I think the important thing to note is that the timing and mechanism by which that sharing would take place still needs to be further elaborated because, on the one hand, you can view open source as something, as source code that you deposit in a public repository and anybody can download it. That's in theory what you're supposed to be able to do with it. But I think it was already brought up earlier, I think by Professor Stark, that there are security implications to open source. So when we talk about open source, I don't think we need to be careful not to be talking about it in that sense of just something that's just openly available. We believe there needs to be a governance, some sort of governance model that is developed, and how that what's the legal constitution of that model, how it's funded, are things that still need to be discussed and developed. That's the direction I think the county wants to go in, that we would like to, obviously we have to work with our board on that because we would have to get approval from the board, but we'd also like to work with the Secretary of State, work with the CA CEO, and understand what would be the best way to share this solution in a way that's open and transparent, and we get the benefits of an open source solution, but it's also controlled because, this is not just some sort of software that you download and start working with. This is the voting system that will be certified, and we want it to continue to be certified. So these issues are critical to the long-term maintenance and support of the VSAP as a certified voting solution. And we also want to ensure that through this governance model, any modifications, fixes, or enhancements to the various components are shared. So there's a structure for everybody who's participating in the solution has reciprocal benefits. I would suggest, I know there's this discussion around the state funding and some of these estimates of $30 to $40 million. I would suggest perhaps that one thing to consider in that regard is how could that money be used to fund the governance model instead of using that money to develop a whole new set of open source software. How can we use that money to establish a governance model for this solution that will help it to adapt to the needs of other jurisdictions, that will be the custodian of, fund a custodianship of the solution. I think that's another alternative use of that funding as opposed to funding the development of a completely new solution. So something to consider there.
Questions, comments, commissioners? Seeing none, offer my thanks to both of you. Did you raise your finger to? Sure.
Yes, I apologize. I didn't mean to interrupt. But I wanted to just clarify something that was spoken about on the first panel. And this is not to contradict anything that Noel and his experience, because I believe that he has experienced what he testified to. But I just wanted, for your clarity, Chairman Nava, it's legally possible and it's legally allowable under California law to cast a provisional ballot on an accessible device. So it could be that some jurisdictions are not doing that for some reason. Maybe they don't have the equipment. And I also wanted to let you know that there's recent law that was passed by the California legislature that was implemented in 2018, that if you show up to a polling place, you've received your vote by mail ballot, you're on the rosters receiving your vote by mail ballot, but you don't have it to turn in, as long as the poll worker can verify that you haven't voted it, you can vote regular. You don't have to vote provisional in that instance. So that is a relatively new law, and hopefully that will address some of the concerns that were brought up in the first panel.
Thank you very much for that. And thank you both for your testimony. It's been very helpful.
Thank you.
Next, I think it's Susan Lapsley. Hello, welcome.
Thank you. I guess I don't constitute a panel, do I?
Sure, you're a panel. You're the majority
Panel of one.
Majority of one.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, commissioners. Thank you for having this taking up this important topic. Thank you to your staff. I had the pleasure of meeting. It was supposed to be an hour meeting, and I think it turned into about 2.5 hours. So my apologies to your staff, but they did a fantastic job trying to understand the issues and get their arms around what is a very complex and deep issue that affects everyone here. I also would like to say thank you to the speakers before me. They covered a lot of ground, and they did a very good job. So I had very little cover at this point, so hopefully I won't bore you too much. Mr. Sebes actually covered the critical infrastructure part. So the critical infrastructure designation happened in 2017 at the beginning, and there was a lot of confusion behind it. No one really knew what it meant, what it was going to, how it was going to apply. Did it mean federal takeover of state elections? What was that going to be? And it is very broad, as Mr. Sebes talked to you. It's the warehouses, it's the software, it's the hardware, it's the big umbrella of items. And so over the last year and a half, we've been working closely with DHS and other stakeholders to really define what that means. What it has really meant is the identifying of resources, the identifying of best practices, and all that's still in flux as we move through elections. And DHS learns, they thought that they knew a lot about elections, but as they got through it, they realized they really didn't. But it's important when we talk about it to understand that words matter. So when we talk about cybersecurity and when we talk about voting equipment, words matter. So as it relates to cybersecurity, I think we all remember the headlines of hacks and breaches and all those kind of words. Those all have very specific meanings in the technical world. And what we're seeing when we talk about those, I think we all need to be clear what we're using. In California, we were not penetrated, we were not hacked, we were not any of those kind of things. Are there people that are always looking at what we're doing and trying to find a way in? Absolutely. We are the biggest voting jurisdiction in the country. LA County being the largest jurisdiction in the country. So there's always people who are interested in finding out where there's holes and breaches. So we have always been interested in security. Security is not a new issue for the Secretary of State's office. As Mr. Runyan talked about and many of the other panelists, security has been on the forefront at the Secretary of State's office going back to the first certification of which is a whole other story, first certification of voting equipment after the passage of the Help America Vote Act, but then also with Secretary Bowen with the top-to-bottom review and looking at security testing and review of that voting equipment. So then also when we talk about voting equipment, I like to conceive it as a pie. There's a lot of pieces to that voting equipment pie, and you've heard a lot about that. There's the voting equipment where you actually cast your ballot. There's the voter registration piece. There's election night reporting piece. There's electronic poll books when you go into the polling place. There's a lot of pieces to that pie. So I too am going to keep my comments specific to voting systems. Each of those technologies within that pie have their own needs, requirements, security risks, challenges that we as the Secretary of State try to address and work closely with the counties to ensure that they're being deployed in the most secure way possible. So the role of the Secretary of State, as you've heard, is to review, test, and certify a lot of these technologies. Ballot unmanned, electronic poll books, we certify ballot printers and manufacturers, and also voting systems. So voting systems, I want to walk you through the process of testing. You've heard a lot about it, but the specifics of what we do. We have what's considered probably the most rigorous testing of voting equipment in the country. We go through a multi-phase process that is based on the California voting system standards. So those were promulgated in 2014. They're regulatory standards for voting system and voting technology testing. Those take and have built upon the previous federal VVSG. You heard Kammi talk about VVSG, voluntary voting system guidelines. So historically, the federal EAC, the Election Assistance Commission, had developed voluntary guidelines, and they've gone through several iterations over the past 15 years. Through the passage of SB 360, we moved away from being reliant on the federal certification process. We said, hey, we do it. We don't want to have to wait for federal certification. We want to create our own standards and do our own testing in our own way. So California developed and promulgated the CVSS, we call them, because we like acronyms in elections. So part of that testing is that we go through functional testing. So we make sure that it functions the way it's intended, and that's building it from top to bottom or bottom to top, whichever way you want to look at it, and ensuring that the system works as intended. And we run it through a variety of different tests for functional testing to make sure it can actually conduct an election. We do volume testing. It's a very extensive volume testing to ensure that the equipment can function the way it's intended on election day. Thousands of ballots being run through the tabulators, both the central count tabulator and the precinct count tabulators. And we have multiple machines. It's actually quite a process and procedure. I invite all of you to attend at our next one. I'll be happy to send the invitation to you so you can see really the process that we go through for volume testing. We do security testing. So security testing involves source code review. So for all those proprietary systems that you've heard the previous speakers talk about, they give us the source code. We contract with a security expert, and they do a source code review of that system. We also do what's called penetration or red team testing. So we take the system build it and provide it to our consultants, and they try to break into it. They try things like putting solvent on the seals. They try screwdrivers. They have a whole bag of tricks. Some of it's a little scary what they do. But they go through penetration testing. We also do accessibility testing. We work closely with the Department of Rehabilitation, Department of Disability Rights of California, also the Commission on there's one other commission, my apologies, I just drew a blank on there, that we work closely with in getting volunteers and going through the exercise of are these systems usable and are they accessible? Because it's really a two-phase approach. Okay, it can be accessible, but is it really usable? And I think Mr. Runyan kind of talked about that the systems, they may be accessible, but they're really not usable. So we run through that exercise. At the end of testing, if the Secretary of State makes a decision on whether or not to certify the system or not. If a decision is made to certify it, part of that certification includes use procedures. So the use procedures dictate how the counties who decide to use that system must use the system. They can't deviate from those. That's part of the certification. We also take what's called the trusted build. So when we talked about we built the system from the ground up with the source code, we take that, the Secretary of State hold it, it's put in escrow, and we distribute it to the county. So it's not coming through the vendor, it's coming through us. It's called a trusted build. And for a long time, we've done that. The escrow is available for counties if they would like to go and review the source code. We do audits periodically. We have a variety of different processes that we go through with that. Once the system is deployed and by a county, there's also, I'm sure you guys have heard much about logic and accuracy testing that's done by the counties. It's open and public process to get the system ready for testing, ensure that it's programmed the right way there and that there aren't any issues with it. By state statute, there's 1% manual tally as well, which you've heard a lot about. It's not risk limiting auditing. The 1% manual tally has been around for many years in California. The Secretary of State's office has supported and been a big advocate for risk limiting auditing. There was a pilot that we joined with Mr. Stark in 2013, I believe, 2014 on risk limiting auditing, and we partnered with several counties to conduct that risk limiting audit pilot program. SB 360, as you've heard, also has a portion of risk limiting audit, and as well that Secretary Padilla was the bill sponsor on. So risk limiting auditing, we've been working closely with Mr. Sebes and a variety of different folks to be able to, the current proposal for risk limiting auditing to be able to come to a resolution so that we can have it available in California and something that's utilized by all counties. I think you heard, obviously, Kammi did her own RLA, risk limiting audit program, but Orange County also did one as well in this last election and had an open process with that. if you ask me what's the biggest risk, security risk for our voting equipment, it's the age. This is equipment that is in use. It goes back to some of it. If you look at LA, but LA's goes back to the 1960s. So a lot of the other of it goes back to the 1980s. It's old equipment. The Secretary has been ringing the alarm since he came into office. We've been working closely with the Governor's office and Department of Finance, and finally the $134 million is a result of that. There's a 50% match by the counties, so the counties have some skin in the game. We do have some counties, I believe 15 counties, that have already upgraded to new equipment. So what's being used in the other counties, separate and apart from those 15, is the old legacy equipment. The legacy equipment was certified not to the new CVSS standards, to the old standards. And we've been at a point where you can't get parts. They're difficult to maintain. They could break down at any moment. And on top of that, it's old technology. It's insecure. We've done everything that we could to mitigate and to put the processes and procedures and physical security around the systems to make them as secure as possible. But it's not good enough for the voters of California. And I think this $134 million will go a long ways in getting all the counties to the new equipment. So right now we have one system that's been certified to the CVSS. We have another system that's currently in test to the CVSS. And then, as you heard, LA has a portion of their system that's being tested to the CVSS. So this is the next generation. We're kind of on this cusp, I think, of a lot of the testimony that you heard is in regard to what happened in the past, the top to bottom review, the legacy equipment, a lot of the stuff that we have been living with for a long time. But now with the new money, and I think all the counties know and understand, they want to move forward. The counties, all 58, are hardworking. They're dedicated to their jobs. They care about security. They care about elections running smoothly and efficiently and being transparent. So we have the past, and we are where we're at, but now with the new money and the inability to get equipment and to be able to service those equipments, we're now moving forward and looking towards the future. I see the money it was passed in this budget, so in July 1st, it became effective. The problem for us to getting it to the counties and getting contracts to the counties has been the implementation of Fiscal. We're in the process of implementing it, and it has brought everything within our department, doing contracts, doing procurement, doing all that kind of stuff. So getting contracts to the counties likely won't happen until September or October because of the Fiscal implementation and what's needed in that process. But it's coming, and it's money. If you take a look at the budget line item, there's requirements in there. It's allowed to reach back, so those 15 counties that have moved to new equipment, they'll be able to get reimbursed for their funds that were spent. It has a requirement that any money that's spent has to be used to buy new equipment that's certified to the new standards. So you can't use it to reach back and get old equipment. You can't use it to get equipment that's not certified. It's got to be certified and certified to the new standards. So there's a lot of good stuff in there. I think the other thing that we can do is funding. You heard it from everyone, but not funding every 15 years. So the last money we got was actually $400 million from HAVA, the Help America Vote Act, and then also the Voting Modernization Bond Act. So of that, the HAVA money was $400 million. About half of it has been used to implement our statewide voter registration database, and then the other half was given to the counties, about $200 million. It's actually about $195, but about $200 million was given to the counties for voting system upgrades. The Voting Modernization Bond Act, which was passed right about the same time, state money, that was used also to improve and to upgrade voting equipment at the time.
When was that?
2002. Okay. So
you've indicated that some of this equipment is it goes back to the 60s and 80s, but That's a lot of money that's been allocated to the counties to improve equipment. So what happened?
So it was allocated through the Help America Vote Act and the VMB, Voting Modernization Bond Act. That was 2002. We didn't actually get the HAVA money until about 2005. And the VMB money was available pretty quickly after it was passed by the legislature. But at the time, we had Florida and the hanging chads, and there was the whole impetus behind, as your previous speakers had articulated, was to get everyone off these old systems at the time, which had hanging chads, your butterfly ballots. A lot of them were the levers. You had that old technology. So at the time, the vendors hurried up to get something in place that would be HAVA compliant. And so it wasn't the best technology. It wasn't probably the best thought out, but at the time it was what HAVA demanded. And California was in a position in 2005, 2006 where the U.S. Department of Justice was threatening to sue us and showing up very regularly with papers drafted ready to sue the state and every county within California in order to get them to be HAVA compliant, to have these voting systems.
So is this the stories we hear about certain equipment that's been purchased that's now sitting in a warehouse someplace not being used?
Yeah, so that's twofold. So it was purchased by the counties because a lot of people just wanted to go straight to electronic voting, right? And California was very smart and ahead of its time at that time and mandated that electronic voting equipment have voter verified paper audit trails, VPATs. And so the counties bought those equipment. You had a change in administration with Secretary Bowen coming in, and a policy decision was made that for those electronic systems that only one per polling place could be used. So you had a lot of counties that had purchased thinking, I'm going to use multiple in all my counties or all my precincts and polling places, then only able to use one. So that's where you have a lot of them that have had to warehouse them. And ironically, the warehousing of them has actually allowed for some of those parts to be Frankensteined and pulled together, and it's provided a resource for parts over the years. But yes, that's exactly what happened. So I say that we need money and we need funding. We had funding in 2002. We have the 134. But as a state, we shouldn't be doing it every 15 years. We shouldn't be waiting until the wheels fall off or until the duct tape starts coming off and you can't find any more duct tape to tape it together. We should be doing it in a comprehensive and thoughtful manner that's right for the voters of California and for taxpayers. So those would be my two top things that I would recommend that the state do. With respect to cybersecurity, our office has it's been a top priority. I've already heard about the Office of Cybersecurity and Risk Assessment that was authorized for our office just in this last budget. We've worked closely with our federal partners since the 2016 election, and we did so before, but even more so now. That includes Department of Homeland Security, that includes FBI, that includes the Election Assistance Commission. It's a whole spectrum of federal partners, and we also work closely with the counties. We conduct training. As I told you, we have use procedures for voting equipment that counties are required to use. We've identified best practices for cybersecurity and provided communications to them, providing resources and suggested resources that they use. We've coordinated closely with CACO. And then recently we did a tabletop exercise with all 58 counties. I'm not sure if you guys are aware of what those are, but they're common in first responder, that area of work, where we go through and you simulate an emergency. We had all 58 counties, and we actually had about 150 participants. And we went through a tabletop exercise with all of them. And it was cybersecurity. It was, a hot polling place where the air conditioning's gone out. It was a whole variety of election day mishaps. We joked as we set it up that it was the worst election day ever possible, imaginable. So we've been working collaboratively with the counties. You had also asked about the $34 million. So we talked about the old HAVA money, the $400 million. In April of this year, Congress passed and the President signed the 2018 Omnibus Spending Bill. In that was a authorization of HAVA money. It's not new HAVA money. It's actually old HAVA money that was never apportioned back in 2002. And over the years, secretaries of state have said, "Hey, you still have this pot of money. Hey, you still have this pot of money. You should give it to the county or to the states." They didn't until 2018. It was $380 million across the United States. California got 34 million, or will get 34 million of it. We haven't actually received it yet. We're hoping it's not like it was in 2002. But they have identified in that there's 6 items that they strongly suggest that it be used for, and those all relate to cybersecurity. Ironically, the first couple don't really apply to us because they have to do with paper ballots and VPATs. California, as you've heard, is a paper-based system. For those that we don't have, where it's electronic-based, we have the VPAT. So as you heard Ms. Smith talk about, there's many states out there that don't. So the first 2 don't really apply to us, but the other has to do with other aspects of cybersecurity. So we have submitted our plan to the EAC. I'll provide that to you guys after this meeting so that you have it. And in that, it's cybersecurity training. It's money to the counties for cybersecurity upgrades. There's a variety of different things that we've articulated that we'd like to use the money for. So that's where the $34 million will go. With that, if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Again, thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thanks. So it sounds like counties have a lot of discretion in what systems they adopt. To what extent could that be more consistent? Or does it just by necessity have to be different in all the counties?
That's a great question. So there are some states that do a bottom-down system where they dictate one system and it's used in all counties. I think you saw between Inyo and LA, and Inyo's, I think Alpine County would argue that Inyo is huge. Alpine County has 800 registered voters, and you have LA who has 5.2 or 5.1 million registered voters. So in California, we have a very wide gap. And you also have, as you heard, a wide gap in resources. So Kammi and her staff wear lots of hats and aren't dedicated to elections, whereas you look at LA, that I believe they have something like 50 committed employees, and then they bring in temps as needed, and can swell to almost, I think, 3,000. So I think it's tough to say in California that one system would work. I think that there's needs that need to be addressed and that each one has for service or just logistics. But it is possible. I think it would take a legislative mandate to do it. And obviously additional funding, because if you dictate one system, then counties are going to have correspondingly more costs depending on how they have to grapple with that system.
The allocation of the $134.3 million, that's going to end up to be, if every county utilized it, would be $268 million, I guess. So what, on the 50% match, has there been a study on does that take care of the equipment that's necessary for those counties? And I know Los Angeles is already down the road quite a bit on theirs, and I heard San Francisco. But is that the pot of money that's needed, or is there more that's needed?
So in coming to that 134, we worked closely with the governor's office and finance to articulate. It was an iterative process of identifying, because you can slice it several different ways. We looked at, we had AB 668, which was, okay, if no match, we gave counties all the resources for their voting systems, their drop boxes, their e-poll books, all those kind of things. How much would it cost? And through a variety of formulas and looking at how many registered voters they have, how many polling places they have, all those different factors, and kind of estimating what equipment would go into there, we came up with a figure of $450 million. Within that, again, being able to slice it, we then started looking at vote center implementation, size of counties, a variety of different factors. So that's how we got to the 134. So I think it depends. The answer is, given how we sliced it and what box we put it in, that 134 with the match gets counties new equipment and upgraded equipment. Does it give them everything that a $450 million price tag would give them? No. And I'd be happy to share also the breakdown by county of what those how that funding breaks down.
Yeah, you can provide that to staff. Any other questions or comments, commissioners? Seeing none, thank you so very much,
Thank you very much
for your testimony. That will conclude the witnesses that were on the agenda. We've got 2 speaker slips, and I'm going to call Mr. Stark because apparently there was some question that prompted.
Thank you very much.
Of course.
Should I speak from here?
It's better on the microphone.
I wanted to respond to a couple of things that Mr. Bennett said because I think that they've introduced potentially some confusion. First of all, I have enormous respect for the magnitude of the difficulty of running an election in Los Angeles County. And every time I see Dean Logan, I tell him how happy I am I don't have his job. That said, Los Angeles County has not performed a pilot risk limiting audit. They rejected an invitation from the Secretary of State to perform such a pilot under AB 2023. They've repeatedly rebuffed my offers to help them conduct a pilot to get an idea of what work would be involved. To my knowledge, they have not observed any of the pilots anywhere, certainly not in California. Orange County is now doing its second risk limiting audit. They're the 3rd largest California county, just barely behind San Diego. The workload for conducting risk limiting audits actually scales very favorably with county size. The fraction of ballots that you need to look at gets smaller and smaller the larger the contest is. Los Angeles' portion of an audit of the recent gubernatorial primary, of the 400 and some odd ballots one would have expected to have to look at for a ballot polling audit, about 100 of them would have come from Los Angeles County, unless problems were detected. And with the VSAP, with the new equipment, the number would have been more like 10 ballots from Los Angeles County. So I can understand the trepidation, especially around audits that expand to start to look at a larger and larger number of ballots. But that only happens if the outcome of the contest is in question. If the audit starts to discover errors, if the margin is razor thin, so forth and so on. And the effort involved in conducting an audit is still less than the effort involved in conducting a recount. And in fact, could save time and trouble at the level of the state for recounts by allowing outcomes to be checked by looking at far fewer ballots and all. So I just wanted to let that pass. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Public comment, Brent Turner. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
And you are with CAVO?
California Association of Voting Officials.
Welcome.
Pardon my attire, but we weren't invited. So I found out at 7 o'clock this morning I was in Half Moon Bay, and this is, I guess, what happens when you work on the fly.
I'm actually very jealous.
Well, thank you. And, we would have liked to have been invited, but that's sort of part of the story here is that as the pioneers of open source voting, we don't often get invited to these kinds of hearings. I'm representing Alan Deckert, who's known as the father of the open source voting movement. Our scientists include Dr. Juan Gilbert, who is the only scientist to have a actual open source voting system deployed. So we were talking about this in some sort of futuristic sense, but the fact is this is already done and implemented in New Hampshire, and I have a letter from the New Hampshire Department of State, the Secretary of State, thanking us for our work and saying that his open source system is doing fine there. It still needs the tabulation piece, but it does have the voter interface and the disabilities components. Also, I wanted to put on the record a couple other articles written by myself and former CIA Director Jim Woolsey. Jim is a good associate and quite interested in this. And basically what we're doing is, for lack of a better term, calling BS on some of the testimony that's been brought to you today. Unfortunately, what we've seen is a small cabal of authorities that continue to dominate this space and control legislation from not only the California state level all the way up to Capitol Hill. We've seen recently what's called the Paper Act by Quigley come forward. The problem is it's a crime of omission. What some of the supposed experts are doing is they're focusing the governmental attention on paper ballots and audits, and they sort of slide off the open source software component. Here we've addressed it fairly well, but unfortunately I won't have time to address it succinctly, and what we've got is some friends of friends filling the space, and that's our problem. We have verified voting taking all the grant monies in the space and providing all the information, and what you get is sort of a Microsoft-based opinion that is not shared by the rest of the election integrity community. What we are here to say is that this is not rocket science. This is completely obtainable to have open source systems in California. It's been done in New Hampshire. We know it can be done here. We are the ones that prompted Los Angeles to start their project through Supervisor Antonovich years and years ago. We are also the pioneers in San Francisco. And just the fact that we were not invited to this should sort of smack of something that is occurring here, and we want to bring it to your attention because we believe the Little Hoover Institute can be very advantageous to our national security. So I've got a comment for the record, which I'm glad to read in. If time will allow, I can take 3 minutes and do that. Thank you. Many know the history of this movement to secure U.S. elections. In 2000, standing on the shoulders of Medgar Evers and other civil rights leaders, Alan Deckard and Open Voting Consortium pioneered open source voting systems. 7 years later, we started a campaign in SF to lead the country toward safe and secure elections. Since then, we have seen open source systems deployed in New Hampshire. Then the 2016 election happened. In New Hampshire, National Association of Voting Officials has worked with Secretary of State Bill Gardner by deploying Dr. Gilbert's open source system. We're currently moving toward the completion of that system. Most recently, Ohio has now certified the absentee aspect of the open source system. We have all witnessed the multi-million-dollar boondoggle of the Los Angeles voting system and their historic mismanagement. We have witnessed the proprietary code sellers collapse the Texas voting system project. However, in San Francisco County, we have overcome some of these expert groups like Verified Voting and OSET, as well as the vendors and the lobbyists, and we are considered to be a shining light currently. The science is available and the project is manageable without the fear, uncertainty, and doubt peddled by corporate interests. The open source voting language is now being carried by Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard's legislation, but is left out of the Quigley Paper Act. This we attribute to the control of Capitol Hill by Verified Voting, working also with the Center for American Progress. Please be aware the real documented pioneers of this work are available for your benefit. Although Verified Voting and others may absorb most all grant monies and media coverage, these sleight of hand tactics are also part and parcel to the current lack of progress and general confusion. Verified Voting and Philip Stark know that open source software is a necessary element for proper security, yet they often omit open source software or backseat reference it as no panacea when presenting information on paper ballots and audits. This omission smacks of corporate influence and is obviously intended to create the purchase cycle of more proprietary voting systems that will be no more secure than the current ones. For the reasons stated, we reject their corporate software influences and request attention be directed toward more reliable and less biased information providers. We have included 2 articles from former CIA Director Jim Woolsey on point. We hope the Hoover Commission stands up on this information. Respectfully submitted, Brent Turner. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. If you could make sure that the material that you have is provided to staff.
Thank you.
Back there, those 2 folks raising their hands.
Thank you, Commissioners. Thank
you bet, and thanks for coming from Half Moon Bay, right?
Yes, sir.
That's where I want to go. Kim Alexander. And this is your group is California Voter Foundation. Thank you.
Hi. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having this hearing and bringing all these folks together today for this really important topic. It is a relief that we are in a better position than other states. In my job as a voter educator, I'm often asked, how can we be sure our votes are secure? And we, in California, benefit from the post-election manual tally law, which we didn't talk a lot about today, but I think you all know about, where we do verify the vote in a public observable way. And that law was enacted in 1965, so we have a longstanding history of recognizing the importance of giving voters the ability to verify the vote with their own eyes. And we also have the voter verified paper trail requirement, which we can thank Senator Prada for co-authoring back in 2004, which was a bipartisan bill and passed unanimously and led to California being at the forefront of what now everybody realizes are the two key ingredients for election security: paper ballots and post-election audits. We also are fortunate to have a Secretary of State who also understands these issues, and he and his staff are very committed to election security and conduct a very rigorous testing and certification process that really is far better than anything else that we see going on in the rest of the country. I did want to just respond very quickly to a couple of comments that were made during today's hearing. One was the comment from Senator Prada about Board of Supervisor members not being very aware of election security, and I do see this in my work as a voter advocate. This is an important observation, and I think one recommendation you might consider is an outreach education project from the state of California to local county boards of supervisors to help educate them about the important role that voting technology plays and their role in funding voting technology at the county level. I also think it's important to notice which registrars are appointed and which ones are elected. In my 25 years working as a voter advocate, I've seen a very big difference in how elected registrars of voters respond to funding challenges compared to appointed ones. When you're appointed by the Board of Supervisors, you are at their mercy in your budget, and you don't have as much ability and freedom and independence to say, you know what, I'm putting this in my budget, and you folks find a way to pay for it. And we see that among elected registrars and a more difficult challenge there for appointed ones. There was the question about whether vote by mail is more secure, and I think it's just important to highlight that it brings with it a very important component of the security process, which is the signature on the envelope that the voter must sign. And I talked with you about this at your hearing back in September in Los Angeles, this issue of ballots getting rejected because the voter's signature is found to not adequately match the signature on file. So this is a case where election security is working against voters, and also a case where, because we are not requiring counties to treat voters the same, you have some counties that are doing extra outreach to contact voters with missing signatures or mismatched signatures and give them a chance to cure or rescue those ballots so they're not disenfranchised. Other counties aren't doing that outreach, and their voters are having their ballots rejected. So this is a point where election security is going a little wayward, and we really need to get a handle on it. In my testimony in September, I talked about this extensively in the ACLU lawsuit that has resulted in Senate Bill 759, which is currently pending and would create a new statewide requirement that this kind of outreach be conducted, which we very much support. We endorse the idea that was suggested today of the Secretary of State playing a role in facilitating county access to technical support for open source voting systems. That is a big impediment and a big benefit, and why counties go to private vendors is because they do need that technical support from the vendor staff. So if we can find a way to provide that kind of support through some state mechanism, that would, I think, really help move open source forward. And on the open source front, we need to really pay attention to what's happening in San Francisco. It was mentioned today, but this is a bottom-up effort created through the San Francisco Election Commission, led by Chris Jordanek, who's a computer scientist in San Francisco, and they are really pushing the ball forward in California on the open source front. So we need to pay attention to that and support that. And I just want to make sure in conclusion, and I talked about this in September with you, that we really understand when we say the state has to pay more money, it's not just about throwing money at counties. It's about moving from passing optional election laws, which come with no funding attached, to passing mandatory election laws, which does require funding. Since Governor Brown was elected, he has suspended funding in the state budget for all state-mandated election programs, and counties have been hamstrung trying to make up those differences. And in the meantime, we've seen this whole rash of optional laws enacted that don't come with any funding attached. So the funding and accountability mechanism is broken. There needs to be a commitment from the state to provide funding to the counties and a commitment from the counties to abide by state laws in a uniform way. And a lot of the laws that the counties are following predate the law that requires this reimbursement. So we hope that you will look at that. And we should be asking the candidates for governor what their commitment is to election security and if they will make further investments in this important area of public policy if they're elected. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I always find that public comment offers us perspectives that aren't necessarily incorporated in the agendas that we develop. And so I'm grateful to those of you who did offer your remarks. And I want to again thank everyone for their contribution to date to this hearing. As you probably know, our process, what we do, staff spends countless hours contacting many of you on the telephone and getting background information and documentation. And then you come to the hearing and offer additional testimony that helps us sort of put the polish on the stone, so to speak. And we're very, very grateful for your volunteerism. I mean, when we talk about poll workers who are primarily volunteers, I think as commissioners we also have to recognize that those of you who came here to offer testimony, you're volunteers as well. And you expended your own time and your money to help contribute to our process. So thank you very much. Stay tuned. There's more work to be done on this topic. Again, thank you. And we'll have a business meeting across the street if anyone is interested. Meeting's adjourned.